But if you do plan on speaking, we're asking that you fill out one of the speaker cards. And hopefully you can consolidate your thoughts if you and 10 others are saying the same thing. Trying to find a way for as many individuals to speak as possible. You will be limited to 1 minute when that part of the meeting begins. And so, again, thank you for your presence and your patience.
Muy buenas tardes, muchas gracias por estar aquí. Estamos esperando 3 miembros más que lleguen para iniciar la reunión. Si alguno de ustedes desea hacer comentarios públicos y alguien en su grupo va a decir lo mismo, escojan un representante para que lo represente. Les vamos a dar 1 minuto a cada uno. Muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Tuesday, April the 23rd, and you are at the Economic Development Committee meeting of the LA City Council. My name is Curran Price, Chair. I'm honored to be joined by a number of my colleagues, Nuria Martinez, Mr. Koretz, Mr. Weezar, and we are here for a exciting discussion on improving and the minimum wage here in the city of Los Angeles. Mr. Clerk, could you read the agenda before us today, please?
Item number 1 is comments from the public regarding establishing a minimum wage for all employees within the city of Los Angeles and inclusion of wage theft provisions to any citywide minimum wage ordinance, and presentation of independent studies on raising the minimum wage and the economic impact on the city.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today as we launch this discussion of our proposal to raise the minimum wage here in Los Angeles. I know that reasonable minds will differ on this topic, but several items related to this deliberation are indisputable. One, in the city of Los Angeles today and across the country, we're facing a sobering reality. Over the past few years, even as we've struggled from a crippling economic recession, the cost of everyday goods like food and fuel and housing has skyrocketed. At the same time, in Los Angeles, wages have shrunk by nearly 10%, forcing many in our city to work 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet. This dynamic, as described by the LA 2020 Commission in their report released last year, has made Los Angeles a less livable city. Addressing this issue was my driving force when I decided to take a stand on this issue. I'm proud to stand with my colleagues, Council members Nuri Martinez, Mike Bonin, and Gil Cedillo to introduce a motion proposing to raise the wages in Los Angeles to $13.25 by 2017 and $15.25 by 2019. And I have a sense of urgency to get this policy enacted as soon as possible because many of the families that I represent cannot wait anymore. For too long, hardworking men and women earning minimum wages have been unable to afford the basic necessities. Families have been forced to choose between living or surviving, between rent or groceries, the light or gas bill, getting the car fixed or a ticket paid. I think that all of us agree that there's a serious need to make changes. Exactly how we make that change is the focal point of our debate and discussion. To that end, as a committee, we requested our chief legislative analyst to commission an economic impact report of our proposed minimum wage increase. We made sure that the study looked at the impacts this change would have on local workers, businesses, and the economy. We took into consideration special circumstances like the impact on small businesses and nonprofits, as well as youth and transitional employment, among other relevant considerations. To inspire a robust debate, I also asked that our business and labor partners to produce their own studies on this issue. What we have now are three very different studies which give us a variety of perspectives and even share a few common themes. I, for one, am eager to hear from these authors on these studies as they help guide our discussion. Prior to hearing from them, however, I would like to give my colleagues a chance to make some comments if they so desire. Seeing no desire at this time, let's hear from our authors. Without further ado, UC Berkeley, Beacon Economics, and Economic Roundtable. Please join us. We're going to give the authors of these three studies approximately 20 minutes or so to provide a summary to us of their findings. There'll be an opportunity for committee members to pose questions, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and comments from the audience. So why don't we start off with UC Berkeley. You can just identify yourself, doctor, and proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Price. My name is Michael Reich. I am a doctor, I guess, of PhD in economics. First of all, I want to say I'm really glad to be here to have a chance to contribute to this very important policy discussion. So thank you, City Council. It is evident, as Mr. Price said, that wages have stagnated and living standards have been falling for many of the people of Los Angeles, as well as the state and the nation. And in response, we've seen a new wave of minimum wage policies put into place now in states and in quite a few cities at levels that we had not seen before. And so this is a very bold proposal that Los Angeles is considering, one of the boldest yet. And of course, it requires a lot of careful study to see what its effect will actually be. I want to say that I'm a professor of economics at the University of California at Berkeley, where I've been for quite a few decades, and that I started studying low-wage labor way back when I was a graduate student at Harvard in the days when Lyndon Johnson was president. So that tells you how young I was when I started graduate school and how old I am now. I have been a proud member of the Berkeley Economics Department, which is basically tied for being the top economics department in the country, certainly so in the area of labor economics, or economics of the labor market. And I'm also the director of the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment, and we have put together quite a few studies of minimum wages and living wages over the past decade now, and we have an excellent track record in our prospective studies in seeing that how the forecasts that we have made have actually come to pass. I've also, in the past decade, after having worked, as I've said, my whole career in low-wage labor market analysis, I've been looking particularly at minimum wage impacts. And my work, along with my co-authors, has really changed the view of economists compared to what it was 10 and 20 years ago. Many more economists, the majority now, favor raises in minimum wages, at least moderate minimum wage increases, favor in the sense that they don't see a substantial or even a detectable negative effect. And that's a big shift in the thinking of the economics profession. My work is cited as being very compelling by the White House, by senators, U.S. senators and Congress members, by the Vice President of the United States. So we've been proud to have that kind of policy impact. The main contribution of some of this academic research has been to show that previous studies on minimum wage effects that found negative effects did not really compare apples to apples. They compared apples to oranges. They're looking at states that raised their minimum wages and what happened afterwards to employment compared to states that did not, but did not check to see whether those states were on similar employment paths even without the minimum wage. So a very important issue is what we in the profession, economics profession, call counterfactual, or the basis, what would have happened. And in my work, I've discovered that in many of the states that raised the minimum wage, employment was falling 2 years before the minimum wage was increased. And so to attribute a decline in the minimum in employment to the minimum wage was to engage in the spurious use of correlation rather than identifying a causal effect. And that research I'll be drawing on too. On the other hand, that research involved fairly moderate increases in the minimum wage, often not indexed. And so it's useful, but of limited use in giving us a prediction of what would happen in Los Angeles, which is why we had to write a 99-page study rather than just tell it all to you on the basis of what we've done in the past. So my presentation today, I want to talk about our frame first, then whether the minimum wage policy that's being discussed would have the impact that the city wants it to have, or the proposers want it to have, then whether there are side effects, negative and positive, and how important those are, and then the specific policy adjustments that could or should be made that the City Council has asked us to consider, such as ones you mentioned, like small businesses or nonprofits and so forth. And I'll turn that part over to my colleague here, Ken Jacobs, and I want to acknowledge also my two co-authors, Ken Jacobs and Annetta Bernhardt, who are here with me. So the framework first, as I said, we engaged in a counterfactual exercise. That is, what would have happened, or what would happen to wages, in particular, if there were no minimum wage policy enacted and implemented by the City of Los Angeles. And the answer, of course, is that wages have been rising at about the same rate as inflation, about 2% per year. Lately, people in low-wage parts of the labor markets, wages have been rising a little faster than average. For a few years before, many years before that, it was slower than average. So one has to take that into account. And one also has to take into account the phasing in of the policy. That 1325 in 2017 is not the same as 1325 today, because there will be inflation and future wage increase. One also has to take into account that the state already has a law that will raise the minimum wage on January 1st, in about, 8 months from now. And that's important in this counterfactual calculation, right? Okay. The methods, and when then one asks, well, what will happen to wages and prices in the next few years? Are they going to go up the same 2 or 2.4% or whatever? Instead of making one decision about that, we have 3 scenarios, kind of optimistic, pessimistic, and mid-range scenarios, so that we can see what are the effects of our assumptions on the numbers that we come up with. And we put that in the report. And have tried to be as transparent as possible with all our assumptions and calculations. Also, our methods draw on all the data that we know of, government data sets. Some are national data sets for which we can use a sample and apply, say, to people who work in Los Angeles. Some are more specifically Los Angeles data sets, whether from the Economic Development Department or quite a few others. And we've been working with these data sets for some time, and we know they have advantages and disadvantages, and we spell those out. Finally, when we do our analysis, we don't just want to use abstract points of logic, some of which you may have learned in Econ 1, such as if one firm raises its price, other firms don't follow, that firm will go out of business. That isn't true in the real world. And if instead we want to try to put some number on that, to what extent can there be price differences? If prices go up in some industries, how much will consumption go down, and so on? Will firms move because there's a wage differential? Well, obviously, big cities are areas of high wages, not of low wages. Most economic activities in large cities, so it can't just be wage differentials that determine where economic activity takes place. So we try to build our analysis on the basis of previous empirical research by many other economists, and to use the best research out there, not just pick a paper whose studies we like, but the ones that are considered to be the best by the profession. Okay, that's all, by the way, and I probably used up a lot of my time already. Well, okay. In terms of the intended effect of the minimum wage, obviously the intended effect is to raise living standards, and to raise living standards more among those who are most needy, not just those in poverty, but because a lot of people are needy, the poverty line is defined very narrowly, and also as people live in families and one has to take into account what contribution that one is making to a family. What we determine after doing all these counterfactuals and different scenarios and so on is that the proposal would in fact increase wages for about 540,000 workers in Los Angeles, people who work in Los Angeles, which is about 38% of the covered workforce. By covered, I mean those who are covered by the law, which does not include federal workers or LA Unified School District employees and other smaller groups. And of that 542,000, about a fifth or so would get increases beyond 1325 because they're the supervisors, say, of someone who's now being raised up to 1325, and of course they're going to get some increase. And by 2019, if you follow through with a 1525 minimum wage, by then our numbers go up to 609,000 who would get increases, which would be 41% of the covered workforce, or in that case about $4,800 for the average worker who gets an increase. The 2017 number was about $3,200. And if you look at what the median wage is in Los Angeles, these numbers seem about right. Even though we've gone to a lot of trouble to make the calculation very precise, you can do a very simple back-of-the-envelope calculation, too. You could say, hey, if the minimum wage is going to be $10 on January 1st, and we're going to have people go up to $13.25 and beyond through this indirect or ripple effect by 2017, and so not all those people who are going to get increases are right at $10. Some of them are already at $12 or so, and so on. You could say, well, the increase should be about $2, and we come out with our calculation to be $1.82. So that makes us feel like our numbers pass the smell test. That we're not way off in what we're calculating. And then if you look more specifically at who will get these increases, it's adults. The median age is 33. Hardly any are teens, and this has changed quite a bit nationally, that the most low-wage workers, or rather the percent of low-wage workers who get minimum wage increases in states and cities that are implementing these are less and less teens, because they're less and less in the labor force, and for reasons that have nothing to do with the minimum wage. And the age of the fast food workforce, for example, is not only increasing, but education levels are increasing as well. So I could go into more detail, but it's in the report, and I'm going to skip that over. I'd say that the result is that the policy will have the intended treatment. It will raise living standards. So then I want to go to the second part of my presentation, which is, what about the side effects? When you get a drug, it might solve your presented problem, but it could also have negative and positive side effects. We want to look at what those negative and positive side effects are on the economy, on the tax revenue, and so forth. And on the negative side, we think firms will raise their prices. Initially, they'll see their profits falling. With the increase in their wage bill, they'll try to raise their prices. Since it's happening to all firms all at once, at the same time, they will be able to sustain some price increases, I should say. And there can be price differentials with respect to different parts of LA, as well as the city versus the non-covered parts of the county that are next to the city. These already exist. It's not that they don't exist now, they exist, and I think in the magnitudes we're talking about, they would continue to continue as such, because firms have many reasons for where they want to locate, not just where wages are lowest. They want to be near the market, near where innovation is taking place, near where traffic is going by the front door, or whatever the reason, or near a appropriate labor force. We also find that not only are most of the workers I need to go back and talk about the treatment, because one very important point I meant to mention, which is when you look at where the affected workers are, they're not spread evenly throughout the city. And in our report, we have very nice maps at the end, so-called heat maps, that show which parts of the city will be most affected, where most of the increases in income will be. And that is to the poorest parts of the city. No surprise that low-paid workers live in low-income parts of the city, and that there is residential segregation by income, which brings this about. On the flip side, it also means, when we talk about the negative effect, the effect of the price increases and increases that therefore consumers will pay, most of that is in the more affluent parts of the city. So there is, in effect, redistribution within Los Angeles itself. It's also, some of the negative effects are that prices go up and spending goes down, and we present some calculations to that effect in Table 11. The positive side is that the workers who receive higher incomes will be spending those higher incomes at the local grocery stores or entertainment or wherever, and that will increase demand in the city, consumer demand. Some of this will occur outside the city because more than half of the workers who work in LA live outside the city. So that's a leakage which affects the county positively, but it means that the costs are borne more by the city than by the suburbs or the surrounding cities, and the benefits, spending benefits, are borne more, or the benefits go more to or go as much to the suburban, the other cities as to the city, central city. If the other cities nearby raise their minimum wage, then by a kind of symmetric kind of thinking, then LA City would gain a lot of the benefits. So it would be in the interest of LA City if it was successful in convincing nearby cities to also raise their minimum wage.
Let me ask you to summarize the next 5 minutes or so.
Okay, thank you. I'll take 1.5 minutes and then give it over to Ken to talk about some of it. We do find that the wage increase would not affect all industries equally. There are about 4 industries that are most affected that we lay out in the report. And we find that when we calculate the negative and positive side effects, that and net those out, because you have to have a ledger, with both sides of the ledger. If you don't, then you're missing half of what's going on. We were very careful to look at both sides of the ledger. And what we find, no matter what we do in varying our assumptions, and we've done what we call sensitivity tests, where we vary some of the empirical data points we use quite a bit, we still find very small effects, side effects, negative and positive put together, so that we conclude that the policy would have its desired treatment effects, and that the side effects are not that large in any way that we can calculate. On the other hand, when we do a risk analysis of what these side effects might be, we realize that when you go forward in time, that the assumptions about where the economy is going to be forward in time are more risky. We've never had an expansion in this country that's gone more than 10 years. If we go into 2019, we're going to break all past records. I doubt very much that's going to happen. On the other hand, I don't really know. We could also be on the verge of much more rapid growth. But there's more risk the farther forward you go in time, and the higher you go in the wage level that you're seeking, because it could be that some of the relationships that we're drawing from to make our estimates break down at the higher level. For example, we talk a lot about turnover reduction, and that's something that could break down. I'll bring it to Ken now.
So, in the policy analysis section of the paper, we respond to the specific questions that were raised by members of the City Council and the public. And I just wanted to mention a couple of these, given time, and then we can take on others if you have questions in the Q&A. We do compare the proposed LA increase to that of other cities, and do find, as Michael mentioned, that it results in a greater share of workers receiving raises than we've seen in previously studied increases. And as Michael noted, that creates some uncertainty about the effects in those longer time periods and higher wages. And for that reason, we do recommend that the City Council monitor the impacts of any minimum wage increase as it goes into effect. Suggested metrics include changes in worker earnings, changes in overall employment, changes in employment in high-impact industries, and it's important to look at those changes compared to other like areas, so that you have a good control to understand what's happening on the basis actually of the minimum wage. We do note that indexing is an important part to maintain the value of the minimum wage, and it also has the benefit of greater predictability for business. So you've got small annual increases rather than periodic large jumps. In the research, we've found no compelling evidence of trade-offs with economic growth to doing indexing. And just note that in the last 20 years, the average increase in the Los Angeles Consumer Price Index has been 2.4%, and it exceeded 4% in just 2 of those years. Also, we note that you need to have strong enforcement. Strong enforcement is crucial in order to realize the benefits of the policy. And that includes a core legal framework, and we outline a set of things that are standard in other California minimum wage laws that should be looked at. The creation of a city enforcement agency with sufficient staffing, partnerships with community-based organizations that have the cultural competency and the trust in the communities, and really learning from past practices. We also do quite a bit in the paper looking at the question of nonprofits specifically, as well as small businesses, teens, and the question of total compensation. And just in the interest of time, we can leave that for questions later. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move on now to our next report from Beacon.
Thank you very much, Council Member.
And we'll give you the same 25 minutes or so.
What's that?
25 minutes.
I'll be quicker than that, not a problem.
Okay.
What'll help speed me up is I have a PowerPoint presentation. As you know, I'm very PowerPoint dependent. Every time I'm here, I have to do one of these things. So, as always, I have some slides to share our thoughts with you. Thanks again for having us here, and a pleasure to be working with the Chamber and yourself on this important issue. I want to start out by saying one thing that's probably most important. What we absolutely agree on here, everybody at this table, and I'm sure everybody in the council itself, agrees that LA has a big working poor problem. The city has a very large share of low-skilled workers compared to other major metropolises. We're dealing with the lingering effect of the Great Recession. There are, of course, the long-term changes of demand for low-skilled labor. And last but not least, here in the city of Los Angeles, we are dealing with the rising housing costs driven by, of course, the severe lack of supply. All of these with tremendous pressure on this, of course, exposed population in our city. Helping these people is not only good for these people, it's good for the city, and it's good for the economy, and it's good for businesses. And I think we all have to recognize that. The disagreement we're having here is not so much about whether or not this issue has to be tackled. It's rather how we need to tackle this particular issue. And in particular, when we started looking into these numbers, we found that the minimum wage, at least as it's in its current form, is really going to have a very bad return for the city in terms of helping this particular group within the city. The benefits are just too diffuse. They're offset by job losses, and ultimately the costs of the city economy are far too high. Now, I want to point something out. I actually agree with my colleague to the right here that at a national or state level, economists are actually fairly shall we say, balanced in terms of raising the national minimum wage or the state minimum wage. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a very sharp increase in a city-level minimum wage, a city, by the way, that represents about 40% of the county's economy and even a smaller share of the broader regional economy with very, very convoluted borders. And the typical sort of state-level analyses or federal-level analysis really don't apply in the case of a city. So let's talk about, first of all, why this matters in the context of who benefits. As we know, of course, many of the working poor in the city of Los Angeles are people who are earning less than $15 an hour and happen to be the primary breadwinners of their family. And this is the population we ought to be concerned about. But we need to flip that around and recognize that that doesn't mean that everybody making under $15 an hour is a city resident that's among the working poor. And that's a critical distinction here. Indeed, when we started running through the numbers, this is what we found. For example, 52% of the households with workers who are earning this much money live in households without children. Remember that the idea of the living wage is based on a four-person family where two of those people are children. 30% of these workers are less than 26 years old. 43% of these workers live in households with a total annual income is greater than $55,000 a year. This might be a small second job or a kid working a few hours on the side. But a large number of these people are not among the working poor. 11% of these people hold a bachelor's degree or more. 19% of these workers are in occupations that very often provide tip or commission income, such as, for example, waiters or people in various sorts of sales positions that are above and beyond the base. And last but not least, probably most importantly of all, 45% of the people who will receive the minimum wage increase don't live in the city of Los Angeles. They live outside the city. And by the way, flip that around. About half the working poor who live in the city of Los Angeles work outside the city and, of course, will not be privy to this increase in wages. But by the way, they will suffer from the increase in prices caused by the increase in these wages. The net result from our perspective is about $1 in $4 of this tax, if you will, on businesses and consumers in the city of Los Angeles will actually go to helping the working poor. 1 out of 4. That's a very low return no matter how you want to look at it. And of course there's another side of it, which is the housing conundrum. You know, I think everybody in this room recognizes that one of the biggest stressors for working poor in the city of Los Angeles is the lack of housing, driven in turn, of course, by the fact that the city has failed to build enough housing to match population growth over the last 2 decades. Well, that's a critical issue because it means the living wage is a moving target. You cannot cure a supply problem by increasing demand. If we give people a big increase in wages, that will increase the demand for housing, but because housing supply does not increase very rapidly, it will simply push rents up, which will in turn absorb a lot of those gains. Go the next step. Remember those half of working poor in the city who are not going to be privy to these wage increases? They're still going to have to deal with those rising rents. In other words, they're going to end up suffering as a result of this particular bill. Well, what about the cost to businesses? Well, we ran our own numbers in this front, and we have definitely some different results than either one of my colleagues in terms of the cost, the baseline cost to businesses. Our numbers, which account for wage compression as well as secondary cost, show that for some very specific industries, the increase in costs as a percent of revenues can be very, very high. For example, for personal services, anywhere between 7.7% to 11% of revenues. Food services, 8% to 12% of revenues. Administrative services, 7 to 9%. Nursing and residential care, 5% to 6.8%. These are big numbers. And remember, about 40% of the city's employment base exists in these impacted sectors. It's not an insignificant portion of the overall labor pool we're talking about. Now, of course, businesses will not be able to absorb those kind of increases in costs. They're going to have to adapt. They're going to have to change. How will they do so? Well, they're absolutely going to have to shift to less labor-intensive production. That is to say, take, for example, your typical McDonald's. They're going to buy more equipment so they can reduce the number of people. That means they're going to be letting people go. There's going to be some employment effect. They're going to have to raise their prices. And I agree. It's not the case that if you raise your prices 10% or 12%, but the person a mile away from you doesn't, it doesn't mean you're going to go out of business, but you are going to lose a portion of your business to that person you're competing with. There is always some degree of elasticity. And keep something in mind. Those who are closer to areas that don't have these higher wage costs will feel that competition that much more fiercely. By our analysis, 35% of all companies in the city of Los Angeles are within 2 miles of a city border, within 2 miles of a city that will not have this sharp increase in labor costs. And of course, we also have to keep in mind, if you're thinking across the lay of the land, where the business is going to be most influenced. Well, it's going to be businesses that have the smallest margins. Take, for example, a typical supermarket in a high-end part of town. They probably have a little more space in order to deal with these cost increases. But then go to one of these lower-income neighborhoods. We know already underserved by much of retail. We talk about food deserts and the issues caused by that in many low-income neighborhoods. Well, those supermarkets that do exist and do serve those populations have the smallest margins of any markets in the city, and those will be most influenced, and those will be the ones that may potentially be pushed right out of business. And overall, there's going to be a reduction in city competitiveness. Some businesses are still going to locate here. There's no doubt about it. Remember, a lot of businesses don't even care about the minimum wage increase. But for those impacted industries, some of those do have a choice. Go back to the idea, 35% of all businesses are within 2 miles of a border. Any of those businesses could move 2 miles. Businesses that want to serve that area 2 miles away can reduce their overall operating costs by 5, 6, 7%. That's not insignificant. We cannot ignore that. And ultimately what this all means is that there's going to be an impact on the economy. We sat down and did some modeling ourselves. And again, I think we came up with fairly reasonable estimates. In no way, shape, or form do we think this hike in the minimum wage is going to cause the city to lose jobs on net. The city will continue to grow. There's plenty of high-wage industries that will do just fine in the city, and some of those supporting businesses will go along with them. But it will nevertheless have a distinct impact on job growth. And by our estimates, we expect the city to have about 150,000 new jobs over the course of the next 5 years through the context of this recovery. We think that raising this minimum wage just to $13.25 will reduce that growth from 150,000 to anywhere between 10 and 77,000. That means 100,000 potential jobs will not be formed in our particular economy. Other workers will see a reduction in their total income as a result of the reduction in hours. And by the way, these are based on elasticities that are pulled out of sort of published literature. This isn't numbers we're pulling from nowhere. And that means, of course, because it's based on real data, on real things that have happened, it already implicitly accounts for the feedback effect of higher wages for workers who get to keep their job. And of course, if you slow down growth in the city, it's also going to slow down revenue growth as well. We expect, or by our models, that we expect overall revenue growth in the city to be impacted by somewhere between a quarter and a third of where it should have been but for this hike in the minimum wage, with sales and gross receipts taxes being the most significant. Of course, we know the city continues to deal with budget problems, and this is not going to help that situation. And of course, workers are going to suffer as well. Remember, when there are job losses, those job losses often hit those who are most exposed. That is to say, the working poor themselves. We estimate that about a third of job losses will occur for workers under 25. And by the way, the unemployment rate for people under 25 here in LA, that is to say under 25 who are looking for a job but can't find it, is already sky high. Another one-third of job losses will occur to workers who do not have a high school diploma. And by the way, many of these folks are undocumented. Now, all these numbers are very conservative because all these numbers are based on really larger geographic areas. They're not scaled to LA. this large economy, but one that's in the center of a much larger economy, an economy that has very convoluted borders, an economy that has many undocumented, low-skilled workers, people who are going to be overly influenced by this particular situation. All issues we have to think about before we proceed forward on this. Now, I realize that this looks a lot different than my colleagues I'm sitting here with right now, but that's because they have different hypotheses. They have different theories behind their work than we do. For example, one of the thoughts is that raising the minimum wage in the city will have a net positive impact on the city economy. But this doesn't make any sense. Ultimately, a higher minimum wage is a transfer. It's a transfer from consumers and businesses to workers. And maybe that transfer is a good thing, but you're changing simply the distribution of the pie. You're not increasing the pie. And I know at some level there's always this idea that, well, some of this money is going to come from multinational conglomerates that make plenty of money and they can afford it. But you know what? That's a small proportion of what we're talking about here. Think of all the small businesses, all the mom and pop businesses who are going to be significantly negative impacted by this. And of course, think of all those low-income workers who will be the first ones who are going to be laid off when this starts to hit. Another hypothesis is that the higher minimum wage in LA City will push wages up in the surrounding areas. Again, that doesn't make any sense. If we raise wages in LA and reduce employment, that's going to increase the overall supply of employment in the county. More supply means a downward pressure on wages, not upward pressure. For those on the outside looking in, they will be facing significantly worse times, not better times, as a result of this. Another big difference is that the idea that raising the minimum wage is good for businesses because of reduced turnover and productivity gains. Listen, we understand that businesses have a choice. And some businesses do choose a higher wage model for their workers. And I can name those off right here now. But you know, every company has to make their own decision. And I think it shows a high degree of hubris that anybody here sitting at this table would pretend to know they know how to run a business better than the person running that business. It's simply not realistic for us to sit here in the halls of academia and pretend that we know better than they do. Another hypothesis is that businesses will want to locate to the city of Los Angeles because of better productivity. Yet again, I go back to this idea. The minimum wage is a tax. It raises prices and reduces profits for business. And that tax, as we know, will reduce the demand to be in Los Angeles. It won't increase in that. And while it is true that there's debate in economics as to the magnitude of the negative impact of the minimum wage, I have yet to see one paper out there, incredible accepted economic research, that suggests that having a higher minimum wage will increase the number of jobs in a local economy. I've never seen that paper, and of course that literature simply doesn't exist in mainstream economic thinking, as simple as that. So to conclude, again, I totally applaud the efforts to help these families struggling in Los Angeles. It's an enormous issue, and it's a complex one, and dealing with this issue is not about we versus they. And I know that's where this is going to go. Ultimately, it's going to end up being about we versus they, but it's not that. The question is not, do we help these people? We absolutely must. The question is what is the right mechanism? And we think that the minimum wage, at least in this current form, is not the right mechanism. The benefits are widely missing the markets, leaving a lot of the working poor behind and making their lives actually more difficult within the city. And on the other side of it, the cost of the city's economy in terms of growth and revenues is quite significant. And you know, I know that there's a lot of folks who kind of say that this isn't that big of a deal. But I would end with this particular thought. Ask the small businesses in your areas, in your districts. Ask them what they think, what it means to them and their day-to-day operations, particularly in the lower incomes economies. On one hand, there'll be a little bit of gain, but the costs are going to be very real, and they're going to be very painful and very difficult for these businesses to deal with. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Okay, last but not least is the Economic Roundtable.
Could you give me the clicker? We also have a PowerPoint presentation, and I have printed copies for the committee. Is it possible to give those to you? Thank you. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here today. I am one of a team of 8 folks that prepared our report. 3 of my colleagues, Patrick Burns, Yvonne Yen Liu, and Robert Habens, are sitting here in the front row and available to back me up when I stumble. The Roundtable is a nonprofit research organization. Before 1991, we were a research unit in Los Angeles County. We were pleased to have the underwriting of the Los Angeles County Federation of Labor for this study, and grateful to them for giving us complete freedom to look at the hard issues and come up with independent recommendations. We began by looking at why an increase is needed, and one of the things that struck us is that of the some nearly 500,000 working-age people in Los Angeles who are in poverty, half of them are in fact working. These are cooks, cashiers, sewing machine operators, janitors, roofers, personal care aides. You're welcome to have a copy if you like. Roofers, construction laborers, dishwashers, waiters and waitresses, and that in Los Angeles, low wages are as much a factor as unemployment in creating poverty. We also looked at what's happened to the real buying power of workers' wages over the past 30, 35 years. The cost of living in Los Angeles is 36% higher than the national average. We're an expensive place to live, and yet the buying power of the income that workers take home, for workers at the 25th percentile, somebody a quarter of the way up the wage ladder, their wages have lost 32% of their buying power. And even for the worker in the middle, their wages have declined 13%. So wages have stagnated. Many people have very low wages, and Los Angeles is an expensive metropolis to live in. We also took a look at the issue of wage theft, and for many workers it's not only an issue of a low formal wage, but not even being paid the wage that was agreed to. A survey carried out in Los Angeles several years ago found that 58% of apparel manufacturing workers didn't get paid the minimum wage, 35% of folks working in private households, a third of janitors, 31% of folks in retail. So enforcement of wages and wage standards is as important as raising wage levels. We looked in some detail at the geographic effects of raising the minimum wage. This was part of looking at the stimulus effect and the upside, the downside being potential stresses on businesses. And Michael referred to this a little while ago, but by and large, the people who get paid low wages are doing things that help us in our daily lives. They're fixing food for us, they're serving it, they're cleaning rooms, they're doing work on our homes. These services are predominantly consumed in more affluent communities. The people who, in fact, have higher incomes are better positioned to pay for these services. So what we're seeing in these maps, the gray dots are where low-wage service jobs are located, and the color in the background is the income of residents living in those communities. So greens are at the top of the income range, and we can see a concentration of low-wage service jobs downtown, out the Wilshire Corridor, and in other more affluent communities. And the other side of this is, well, where does this pay go home to when workers get higher wages? What neighborhoods, in fact, are going to see a change in their buying power? And the map on the left is the effects of a $13.25 an hour wage increase. The darkest blue colors are increases over 7% in the total earned income of everybody in that census tract, not just the folks getting the wage increase. The map on the right is a $15.25 wage scenario. So we see transformational possibilities as workers who take care of our children, clean our rooms, fix our food, take fair wages back to their communities, that in fact there's going to be much stronger markets for services and goods in the communities where they live, and opportunities for new businesses to emerge and grow. We also looked at labor flows between Los Angeles and neighboring cities. And so this is a peculiar kind of graph. It's called a tree graph, and the size of the block is the size of the labor flow. In this case, we're looking at workers leaving Los Angeles to work in neighboring communities. And the color tells the direction of change. Red is a lot of growth in that flow of workers. Dark blue is decline. And interestingly, the biggest flow of workers across Los Angeles city line is from the San Fernando Valley into Burbank. So lots of residents of Los Angeles going to Burbank to work in stores, to work in restaurants, to provide services. Los Angeles's labor force is about 100 times larger than Burbank's. So our assessment is that as Los Angeles raises wages, Los Angeles will attract the most qualified and most competent workers. As neighboring cities want to also compete for the most qualified workers, they're going to have to offer competitive wages. So our assessment is that Los Angeles is not going to be a wage island, but that these effects are going to spill across the city line to neighboring cities. We also took a very detailed look at industries that would be affected and assessed in particular the industries that look like they're going to experience the most stress. One of the issues that affects the resilience of industries is size. A majority of establishments are quite small, smaller than four employees or smaller. At the other end of the spectrum, a very small fraction of establishments in the community, the establishments with 1,000 or more employees, account for 20% of the city's employment. And what we see is that small businesses are a seedbed of innovation and new business startups, that about 14% of small businesses close from one year to the next without any increase in the minimum wage. But new businesses start and take their place. Among micro establishments, establishments with less than half an employee, the closure rate is far higher. It's something in the order of 65%. So we see large establishments being resilient, having resources to adapt business models and change. We see in small businesses a seedbed of innovation and growth, and our anticipation is that new businesses will emerge as new markets emerge and grow stronger. This print is far too small to read, but we looked at all of the industries in the city. We looked at their size. We looked at the direction of change. And when they're highlighted in green, it means there's a potential issue. Some industries have fairly high rates of decline. We looked at average pay in the industry. Some industries just have a low wage structure. We looked at the share of workers in industries paid less than $15.25. There are a set of industries that have a low-wage business model. We looked at wages as a share of profit, the amount of money that businesses have to play with. And in some industries, that's very large. In other industries, the profit margins are very thin, so there's less profit to play with. We looked at wages as a share of the total revenue that industries get. In some cases, wages eat up a lot of the revenue that industries get. We looked at the amount of value added per worker in each industry. And out of all of this, we identified 7 industries that we think are going to face stresses. These include apparel manufacturers, a kind of industry conglomerate that has temporary employment agencies and janitors and security guards and other services to business, home health care, residential nursing, child care, restaurants, personal repair and services. And our assessment is that these industries, except for apparel manufacturing, have a strong consumer base. These are services that for the most part are growing. We want them, and there's a strong demand for them. We also recommend that the city go into wage increases with its eyes open and with tools for recognizing any problems if they emerge and responding to and fixing those problems. We recommend looking at changes in the amount of sales, taxable sales in Los Angeles compared to the balance of the county in California, annual changes in employment, and annual changes in wages. And we have some additional, more technical tools that I won't go into, but these data sources kick in pretty quickly, and the wage increases being considered by the city are staged over 5 years. The initial effects are comparable to effects studied very often elsewhere as wages have increased. As additional years go by, there's much more data available to look at the effects and if there are issues to respond to them. So we think that it's possible for the city both to raise wages to meet the needs of folks who live here and also have capabilities for understanding the effects and managing and responding to any unintended consequences if they emerge. We recommend that wage policy should be enforced, and the best practices for enforcement from other cities include having an enforcement agency, taking action against firms that violate wages and are contracting with the city or gets city business licenses or permits, have the capability to establish liens against unpaid wages, post notices in business establishments about wage standards, have significant fines and citations and penalties for not complying with wage standards, to criminalize wage theft, to criminalize not paying workers the minimum that they're legally entitled to have a right of private action so that workers can litigate, can take unpaid wages to court, to protect workers against retaliation, and to fund outreach and education to both workers and employers. And finally, in conclusion, our overall conclusions are that low-wage workers in Los Angeles need higher wages for the city to be sustainable, for the city to be socially sustainable, for low-wage workers to be able to live here and provide the services we want, that higher wages have the potential to be an engine of economic growth, potentially having a transformational effect on low-income neighborhoods, that some businesses will be challenged to adapt their business models to pay higher wages, and that the city should have a data dashboard for tracking effects and making sure that at the end of the day the trade-offs are what the city wants. And so we recommend, our final recommendations are adopting a $15.25 minimum wage in 5 annual increments, benchmarking it against increases in the minimum wage with a floor of 0 and a ceiling of 4% as the annual adjustment boundaries, applying the wage standard to all wage and salary employees without exemptions or exceptions, and having strong tools for enforcement. So on behalf of myself and my colleagues on our research team, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to present here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we certainly appreciate the report from the authors and your organizations on the very fine work that you've done, providing us with a real benchmark of information from which to make our decision. I know my colleagues have been waiting patiently. I'm going to get the question started, however, with one to each of you that I'd like for you all to respond to. As has been stated, more and more cities are launching a debate about raising the minimum wage. In our area, Pasadena, West Hollywood, Santa Monica have discussed raising the age. Yesterday, County Supervisor Kuehl announced that she will be seeking to raise the wage in corporate areas of L.A. If more and more surrounding areas do raise the wage, including the County of L.A., what's the impact going to be to the city? If you can kind of restate your position on this issue, how does this affect your study's findings?
Shall I go first, or do you want to go first? Go ahead, Michael.
What? Do you want? That's an excellent question, and it isn't just a hypothetical question because we've seen in other areas that that same phenomenon has occurred. That Albuquerque, for example, which is a pretty low-wage city, raised its own minimum wage, and then the county followed soon after, including all the unincorporated areas. Similarly, in the Bay Area, San Francisco was the first city to have a city minimum wage. It's projected to go to $15 in a couple of years. Now, Oakland, Berkeley, Richmond, San Jose, Mountain View, Sunnyvale, all independently are raising their minimum wages as well. In the Mid-Atlantic part of the United States, the District of Columbia had its own citywide minimum wage. It's now raising that quite a bit, and two of the counties adjacent to it in Maryland are going along. So you see here, just kind of by the market test, it seems to be the case that there's an attempt to have some kind of regional coordination. And if that happens in the LA area, as you're suggesting, I think that would be a good thing. It would mitigate the border effects that a colleague to my left has emphasized so much, and which I've mentioned. It would certainly also benefit the city quite a bit, because right now many of the workers in those other communities live in Los Angeles, and they commute from Los Angeles to Pasadena or Burbank or whatever, and so they would see increases, and they would be spending those within Los Angeles. So yes, I think there's only benefits to that process.
Colleague to the left.
Obviously, it would have some mitigating effect if other cities did it. I would suggest that the impact of the mitigation is going to depend on how many of these cities actually do it and the degree to which they do it. It is true that Santa Monica, West Hollywood are talking about it, but those are tiny economies. They're hardly relevant.
Let's say L.A. County.
Well, LA County is only about 10% of the overall economy, and most of the unincorporated areas actually don't border the city of LA directly. So that has less of an impact overall. It does have some modest impact here and there, but again, it's very small spots. The big ones would be Torrance, Glendale, Burbank, and as far as I know, there's been no conversations about that there. And let's remember that obviously LA is not a county. Even the county is not an island unto itself. Obviously, we have Orange County south of here in the Inland Empire, due east of here, and again, those areas are highly unlikely to pursue such an effort at this particular point in time from the work we've done in those areas.
Well, I think that it would be most coherent as a regional strategy, and so it is encouraging to see initiatives being debated in other cities. And we have very large labor flows across city lines, particularly out of smaller cities. And so reciprocity in paying fair wages and having living wage standards would be very beneficial across city lines.
You know, I'm the co-author of this proposal, and I certainly support the raising the minimum wage. I'm also a supporter of small businesses and want to make sure that we mitigate any negative impacts to them as much as possible. All of you touch on this in your reports, but you don't recommend a definition. Based on your data and research, how would you define small business? And we can... Is that speaking once? Yeah, it's on.
Yeah. Okay, the definition of small business is a complicated thing to do. We do find that smaller businesses have a higher share of their workers who would be affected by the wage increase. But there's no sort of discontinuity point that you get to a certain number of workers and boom, it changes, and you can say that's where the line should be. It's also complicated by the fact that you have some small businesses that have very high margins and some larger businesses with very low margins. So there's no single place, an easy place to put that line. I think in the end that is sort of a judgment call where you look at what share of the workers. I think that table that the gentleman from the Economic Roundtable, their report put forward is useful to look at in terms of where you could draw some of those lines. And then the other thing is to think in, if you're looking at a phase-in where everyone's going to reach the same wage at the end, then whoever's phasing in is going to have to catch up and be growing at a faster rate than those businesses that are already there. And so you want to be careful about how large that distance is at the beginning. And what we've seen in other cities is several cities had small businesses come in 1 year later than larger firms. Most of the ones that have done longer phase-in for small businesses, it's been 10 and below. One of them was 25 and below. Seattle has the largest level, and they've got a little more complicated, but they do all then ultimately phase up to the same level.
Not much to add.
Okay.
We saw a break point above 4 employees in industry survival rates that the highest rates of kind of closure and risk of closure was among establishments with 4 or fewer employees. I'd also say that the business world is dynamic. It's not static. And so at the end of the day, I think the biggest public interest is in maintaining levels of employment. And that if some firms close, that there is new births and startups of businesses. And so I think the most important thing is the net outcome of businesses from the wage. And there may be opportunities for new small business startups in neighborhoods that do have higher levels of earnings coming into them as a result of the higher minimum wage.
Thank you.
Could I just add that a problem with a small business exemption or phase-in at whatever level is you have the perverse incentive that the firm may not want to increase its employment when it gets near that level, doesn't want to go above that. And you don't want to build that kind of incentive into the policy. Also, quite a lot of the research that has been done on minimum wages has centered on the restaurant industry, which is predominantly small business by some measures. And we haven't found that there have been particularly negative effects on the restaurant industry. So, but on the other hand, if you exempt small business, say at a 50 level cutoff or 100 level, you're going to eliminate a huge proportion of the people who would be getting wage increases. It's not a small carve-out, it's a very big carve-out.
Pardon me. Yeah, I mean those are relevant. I would point out that restaurants are some of the most influenced. The numbers are very high, and I would also point out that small companies are also probably the most mobile. They're the ones who have the easiest time picking up and moving outside of city boundaries, as the case may be.
Thank you. Mr. Krikorian.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this very fact-dense and informative hearing. I think whenever you get 3 very highly trained and celebrated, esteemed economists in one place, you're going to get at least 3 different analyses of the same data. And I really appreciate having that because it gives us an opportunity to really kind of wade through where there's agreement, where there may be disagreement and uncertainty that we're going to have to grapple with as policymakers, and how we can focus most closely on the kinds of solutions that will address some of that uncertainty. So I want to first, I guess, focus on the agreement. And I think there seems to be wide agreement that Los Angeles suffers from an extremely high degree of wage disparity and an extremely high degree of high percentage of working poor people here that inhibits our progress, I think, as a community and as a city. But there also seems to be a pretty wide consensus among you that in figuring out the solution to that, there are large areas of this data that are inherently uncertain and where there's a high degree of risk in trying to create a model that projects what the impacts will be. Is that fair to say on both of those points? Would all of the three of you agree with those 2 points?
I obviously can't speak for the gentleman on both sides of me here, but again, we can think about, for example, Los Angeles compared to, let's take two of the, well, first of all, most major minimum wage programs in the past have been done on the state level at a minimum. This kind of movement to city level minimum wages is relatively new. It's a brand new experiment, and in many ways we don't have the data yet to fully what I would call flesh out an empirical model to help us better understand the impacts of this. But I would also go to the next step, which is to say that, let's say we did get some data on Seattle or San Francisco, that data would not be terribly relevant to the conversation for the city of Los Angeles because the workforces in those cities are completely different than our workforce. The fact of the matter is Los Angeles has at least twice the number of workers as a share of our workforce who don't even have a high school degree relative to these other places. I mean, San Francisco and San Jose, Seattle, these are all high-tech metropolises with tons of very skilled people. And instituting this here, again, cannot be represented accurately by what's happening in those particular cities. So in many ways, yes, we're absolutely going down this path of the unknown, and critically, I think that's something that council members should be considering.
Let's see if I can counter that. I expect I would want to. The reality is that Los Angeles, it's true, has a lot of low-wage workers and less educated, less than high school educated, but these are differences that are quantitative, they're not qualitative. Certainly for San Jose or Albuquerque or many other cities. And when I did my studies that were they were based on state policy differentials, but they were at county lines. They were comparing counties on either side of a state border. That's a pretty local study. There have also been studies done at the zip code level, showing no minimum wage effect at the zip code level. So we do have actually quite a bit of experience. As far as the kind of zigzag of LA's borders and so forth, and being in a large metropolitan area, well, that's true in Seattle, but it's especially true in San Jose, which I think is a model. My colleague authored a report indicating that the minimum wage jumped from $8 to $10 in San Jose. My colleague to my left would have very big negative effects on San Jose.
No, I'm sorry, sir, but that's misstating our research. That's not what we said. We said off trend. That's the impact it would have. Thank you. Please, if you're going to state our research, please state it correctly.
I'm talking about your San Jose report.
That's what I'm talking
there was
about.
No
that was off trend. We obviously never said that San Jose was going to lose jobs.
Well, to me, they're the same thing. That is, compared to a baseline of what it would have been. We're not. That's a distinction without a difference. In any case, I think there's more knowledge here. It's not the case that economists don't know, and we always have two opinions, and two hands and so on. You want a one-handed economist. The bulk of the research done on locally based data does show, up to this point, pretty small effects, if any. Some even show positive effects. Apparently, my colleague needs to read more of the literature. The report that he draws on is so far, by Muir and West, is so far outside that previous literature. I think it's a big risk to use a study that no one has found such big effects.
Sorry, Professor.
Yeah.
I want to pull it back a little bit because
Yeah.
no one here understands the nuances of some study that was done previously, other than the five of you. I mean, we don't.
Well, I just wanted to.
But let me bring it back if
Yeah.
I can to the point of my question,
Fine.
which is and I didn't mean to be demeaning to the science of economics, if that's the way it came out. What I mean is that in order for you to predict impacts, each of you creates a very complex modeling system based on a number of assumptions that could be widely variant. Is that true? I mean, that's where I want to come back to.
Well, I would say in our report, we really asked that very question. What happens if we make very different assumptions? And we were surprised how little difference it made in terms of at least for 2017, on the impact on the city.
Right, but for example, one of those assumptions that you all tried to grapple with, which is a difficult one, is this issue of the degree to which a minimum wage increase can be passed on in higher prices, the price elasticity issue, and so forth. And an issue that I hadn't actually thought much about until you just presented today was to what degree will LA's working poor be hurt by increases in prices in Los Angeles as prices go up, assuming that prices do go up to pay for the minimum wage in Los Angeles. If people are living here and working, as you pointed out, very often in Burbank, where they're not getting a wage increase, and here they're paying higher prices, how do we quantify that as far as its impact on
we have
poor people
quantified
here in
that.
Los Angeles?
We have quantified that in the report, and the price increase we're talking about is 0.5% for 2017 at $13.25. It's 0.9% at $15.25. Let me also say that this is not a new topic for me. The research literature in the past, the studies from the Chicago Fed, have shown what price increases occur, and they're about 0 or 10% increase in the minimum wage, about 0.7% for restaurants. Those are based on national data. I've collected data from 1,000 restaurants in or near San Jose, both before and after the minimum wage increase that did go into effect in 2013. And we're finding price increases in San Jose compared to outside, before versus after. It's what we call a difference in difference method. And they're very much in line with the results of the Chicago Fed. So when I think that prices might go up, it's not, or when I say that prices might go up, it's not because I think so, it's because I'm seeing it in the data. And we're very data-driven in our discussion.
I would just offer one comment that's a little bit of a twist on your question, and that is that two of the studies used very different methodologies and different data and arrived at similar conclusions, ourselves and Berkeley's study. And so I think that's useful validation. We don't understand the Beacon study as well as we'd like to, but we draw reassurance from having arrived at the same final conclusion as our colleagues from Berkeley.
Okay. There was, in the Berkeley study, there was an indication that there's scant evidence about profit impacts. So do you all agree with that? That there's scant evidence in the literature about profit impacts on businesses from minimum wage?
I don't want to get dragged into a technical debate on this. You're right. This is not helpful to anybody. But I do have to take issue with the idea that the work done by the Berkeley Labor Center is widely accepted in economic literature. There's plenty of critiques of the work done by my colleague to the right. I'm happy to point those to you and his methodologies and the results he's come up with, and I will leave it at that.
Okay. Again, I'm kind of sorry I started this. What I meant to say, what I meant to say is that when you set up a complicated model, and that you all understand that, the vast majority of the population will never be able to understand because it's at a very high academic level. You create this model with lots of moving parts. As some of those moving parts change, and as different assumptions are plugged into those moving parts, the outcome is going to be different. That was the only point I was trying to make. I think it's kind of self-evident. Now, the outcome might not be huge. Maybe there's general agreement, but it might be. I mean, one of the argument in the Berkeley study, there was an indication that the literature shows assumptions from 0 to 100% in terms of price increases that come from minimum wage increases. That there's some studies that find 0 impact on prices, some that find 100% impact. That's a pretty big range, and that's going to produce different outcomes. That was the only point I was trying to make with this. I want to talk about border impacts a little bit, and Mr. Chair, I have more questions than we have time for. So let me just focus a little bit on this one point on border impacts because this was a very interesting point about Burbank in particular that the Economic Roundtable analysis pointed out. It's very particularly important to me because I represent the district just to the west of Burbank with lots of low-wage workers living in apartments and probably commuting to those jobs in Burbank. But I draw a little different conclusion and that I just want to explore with you a little bit. One of the reasons for that is that since the collapse of the aircraft industry, Burbank has rallied its economy by focusing on the entertainment industry and retail. So it has a much larger percentage of its economy based on retail than the East San Fernando Valley does, I can guarantee you. A low-wage industry with lots of minimum wage jobs. But Berkeley is not an affordable place. I'm sorry, Berkeley. Probably applies to Berkeley too. Burbank is not a very affordable place for low-wage workers to live. They must live in North Hollywood in order to find a place to live. They work in Burbank. So I think the concern that I have about that is exactly the point that we've raised here, that many of my constituents living in North Hollywood and commuting to those jobs in Burbank are going to pay higher prices in the San Fernando Valley when they go home and try to put food on the table, and they're not going to get an increase in wages because they're working in Burbank. So that is a very big concern. And I think that the conclusion that you draw of having competition for these workers driving up wages in surrounding communities, I mean, to be blunt about it, I mean, the competition for workers in this area, I don't think is for the minimum wage workers. It's for workers that have specific marketable higher wage skills. That's where the competition for workers is, isn't it?
Can I respond? The question of how
Michael,
much...
let me just respond to that.
Yeah, sure.
The map that we showed was specifically of low-wage workers. So that map that we projected was specifically the flow of low-wage workers out of the city.
I know. My question is on the competition aspect. You conclude from that Burbank is going to have to compete with Los Angeles in order to continue to be competitive in attracting workers. But
But the idea I would offer is that your constituents can commute in any direction. So it's not just east, it's north, it's west. And so that commuting radius of roughly a half-hour commute will take them to other employment opportunities. And if there are higher wages for the work they do, being a retail cashier, doing food prep in a restaurant kitchen, being a construction laborer in the city than in Burbank, the workers that are most able to compete, even at that wage level, are going to go for the better paid jobs. So that's the basis for our reasoning that these wage boundaries are not going to be contained by the city boundaries, but the effects will spill over the city line.
Right, and I'm sure they would prefer to work at the job in Los Angeles with a higher wage. But the point is, these jobs are not going unfilled. Minimum wage jobs are not the jobs that employers are having trouble filling in this economy, right? I mean, unless there's...
No, that's not true.
Really?
Yeah, the vacancy rates are much higher in minimum wage jobs than in any other part of the economy. Turnover is higher.
Well, the turnover is higher, but they get filled.
No, there's unfilled vacancy. These firms are hiring all the time, and people are staying 2 to 3 months. It shows up in the turnover data by industry, by wage. So you know it's
Okay, but if I'm sorry,
it's
but
a
if,
case
but, I'm
where
sorry, but if that were true, then it would be in the business's interests to raise wages. All businesses,
that's a very
regardless of
interesting
minimum
that's a very
wage.
interesting point, which was raised by my colleague to my left when he talked about hubris. I think that's how he pronounced it. The fact is that a higher minimum wage will reduce turnover, and in some cases, a higher wage will reduce turnover. We've recently seen Walmart and Marshalls and Target, have all done this, and the Gap before that. We're going to raise our own internal minimum wage $9 or $10, and one of the reasons they cite is the problem of high turnover and low productivity. However, it doesn't mean that for every firm the return to raising the wage, because they will have lower turnover, is 100%. Otherwise, they would all be doing it, of course.
Right.
But it's probably, we figure somewhere between, in our report, we say, I think, between 10 and 15 or 20%, which is still a big improvement in the efficiency of our labor market, because then those people are getting more training and the productivity goes up and so forth. We just have a lot of job churning in this economy. On your other question about rents going up, I think it's a really interesting point. But again, I would say the evidence is very scant. I'm reluctant to say whether that will occur. It sounds logical, but the key thing is how big is it? And we don't really know. There's no studies that I know of that question.
One final point just on rents, and I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I don't want to monopolize this, but on page 41 you talked about vacancy rates in surrounding areas being a disincentive to business mobility. So if I understand it correctly, the idea is if you're a business in, say, someplace in Los Angeles, there's low vacancy rates in surrounding areas, it's going to be harder for you to move, notwithstanding the increase in wage costs. Is that right?
Yeah, when I looked, I was surprised. I wish Berkeley had as low vacancy rates as I'm seeing in these commercial data sets. We're not talking about retail vacancy, not employee vacancy, not job vacancy. And it isn't just that it was a little bit lower outside. It's actually, they weren't that far apart. It's just that they were low and trending down. And so that means that, all the prime spaces have already been filled.
But they're very low in Los Angeles as well.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that's right. So a firm that's already based here in the city is going to have trouble finding as good a spot outside when vacancies are low compared to when they're high.
If I may, obviously there's a dynamic aspect to this. If there is a movement of business outside the city and vacancy rates start to go down there and rents start to go up as the natural market response is, that will in turn lead to obviously more demand for construction in these outlying cities. And they will, of course, adapt to this by having more investment in their community and more offices and shopping centers being built, whereas that business will not happen here in the city of Los Angeles. Yet again, a negative impact for the overall city's economy over the next few years.
Okay. We'll come back to you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Koretz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to focus on things that I hope we can find a consensus on. And in my own selfish interest, some of the things I've been working on for years, so I hope we can get there. The first is wage theft. And I was doing legislation almost 15 years ago at the state level. At the state level, ironically, the business organizations all came out on the side of those trying to maintain cheating out of the wage, to the detriment of their members that were actually paying an honest wage. I don't believe that's the case here in Los Angeles. So I'd like to get all of your thoughts in a little more detail on wage theft, because I actually think that's the most important first step, because it doesn't help people if you're being paid $5 an hour and the minimum wage is $15. It just means the gap is greater between those businesses that cheat as a business model and those that remain honest. And other than perhaps the the apparel manufacturing industry, there's virtually no industry in which I can see a negative to eliminating wage theft. If janitorial employers all wind up paying whatever the going rate is, $9 an hour, $10 an hour, if it forced the people that were paying $5 an hour out of business, so much the better. Let it go to the people that are actually doing the honest employment. There's no disadvantage that I see, and obviously the big advantage is that workers that are getting underpaid and cheated out of some, or in some cases, all of their wages, will actually get paid their wage, and that money goes into the economy. And I don't see a downside. I'm wondering if any of you see a downside, and if not, should we be focusing on this as the obvious big first step, because a huge percentage of low-wage workers come under this. Estimates around 25% of our low-wage workers in the city of Los Angeles.
Of course, you're right. I mean, that seems to be an obvious concern. People are being cheated out of their just wages. So I don't think anybody up here could possibly argue with that.
I really appreciate that you raised this issue, and I should say I was one of the authors of that major 3-city study, of which LA was one of the cities that for the first time really documented the wide extent of wage theft in virtually every industry in LA and the other 2 cities. I don't know that we need to get caught up in sequencing these 2 steps, and actually I think when we, in our recommendations, really flagged the idea of creating a city agency, to me, there's an opportunity here of both passing a citywide minimum wage law and at the same time creating a city-based infrastructure for really starting to do very focused on-the-ground enforcement in collaboration with community groups, with investigative staff that really have knowledge about the very particular industries in Los Angeles that begin to get to know employers, that can do that type of deep touch type of enforcement that I think is very hard for a state DOL to do. So to me, I actually think that this city minimum wage law will allow us the opportunity to get at LA's existing wage theft problem at the same time.
And that's actually kind of what I'm getting at.
Okay.
I mean, there are great proposals for enforcement. There are also proposals for self-enforcement, like huge penalties, like doubling what you owe an employee every 2 weeks or a month until you pay when you owe money in the form of wage theft. And I think that alone would solve half of the problem or more. People look at it and say, okay, in a few months, instead of owing someone $1,000, I'm going to owe them $20,000. I think it's not worth the risk, so they will actually start paying them the wages that they're owed.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I think when we were reviewing the cities in California that have already passed city minimum wage laws, you're seeing a real convergence in exactly those types of provisions that are in almost all of the laws, like private right of action, like strengthening penalties. So I actually think there's real consensus growing here, and I think in the long run, what you're really looking for is sort of a complementarity between state-level enforcement and the city's own enforcement efforts, and that they work together and reinforce one another.
I would add to that the state's enforcement resources are very thin. Our understanding is there are only 2 investigators for the Los Angeles region. They have a great many cases, and our understanding is even of the cases that are pursued, only 13% of the wages owed are paid. So enforcement is very inadequate at this point.
And that was part of why 13 years ago I proposed similar legislation, because people are winning their cases and they're still not getting paid. And I think that obviously would change dramatically. Also, I think indexing is important, and hopefully we can all agree. Again, this was a battle we fought at the state level, and I couldn't convince the business side, even when they looked at 50 years of history, and it showed 1968 you had a certain level, and almost 50 years later if you adjusted it for inflation, you'd be exactly where we were. Yet people on both sides thought they could out-battle the other, and business could stop minimum wage, and then employees were impacted, and then suddenly there'd be a big boost in the minimum wage. So once we decide where the sweet spot is, where an appropriate living wage is, I think it's important to have indexing rather than having the business community and everybody else fighting back and forth for years on end about these more modest adjustments. So hopefully, again, that's something that we can all agree on.
We're in complete accord with you on that.
And I don't know if the more business-oriented gentleman here would like to respond to that.
I would argue that there's two things you might want to think about. I mean, first of all, the business community may hear that, but the business community is also thinking, well, that doesn't stop further efforts to raise the minimum wage, but whatever the base is at that point in time. So I think that at some level, if you could lock it down and promise never to change it again, leave it in index form, that may be possibly the case. But I think that there's maybe an inherent issue of what could happen later down the line. That would be my only answer for that. But it's not an issue I've thought through at a deep level.
Okay. And something I haven't thought a lot about, but the report gives us some question. If we're looking at the possibility of exempting small business, it seems like if we were going to do that, a logical place would be the very small businesses, because it looks like above 4 or 5 employees, businesses in LA City seem to be very stable. And so the ones that aren't, obviously the ones with 1 employee had a very high rate of failure, and those 1 through 4 had a pretty high rate of failure comparatively. So I don't know whether we wind up looking at that or not, but certainly in my mind that would seem like an appropriate place to look.
My understanding is federal standards on what's a small business, what's not, is usually much larger than that, the 50 to 100 range. And I'd also want to point out that, at least in the context of our discussion on this issue, we never really thought about the idea of businesses either surviving or failing. Rather, from our perspective, we look at, we worked with, for example, an owner of a few McDonald's franchises, and he sat down with us and kind of walked us through how he would deal with this. He never talked about closing down any of his McDonald's. He will continue to operate them. But what he is going to do is limit the hours, limit the number of people, invest in more equipment in order to reduce his exposure to those pay increases. And so ultimately, it's more about these individual businesses reducing the number of people they have rather than, say, businesses is flat out failing.
Well, I'm hearing from a lot of people claiming they're going to go out of business as well, but I think at least, and they may have those concerns, and I don't know whether they come to fruition. I think probably not. But it looks like if there is a group that we look to protect, based on the numbers, that looks like a group that would call out for it.
Well, we know every community is different. We certainly are sensitive to the concerns of small businesses in this area. But we also know that the fear that businesses were going to close and leave town because of increases in minimum wage have not come to fruition in all cases. And so every situation is going to be a little different. Councilwoman Martinez.
Mr. President, I'm not used to sitting on this side of the horseshoe. Sorry, Mike, if I mess up your desk. So when my colleagues and I introduced this motion, my goal was to create a policy that ensured that everyone in our city had a real chance to earn a living and still be able to raise their kids in the city. And one of the ways by doing that is by increasing the minimum wage, but doing it in a responsible way. I've read all 3 reports, and without having to romanticize poverty, because I know all too well what that's like, I don't need to read a statistic, and I don't need to read another study to tell me what it feels like to be poor. And I know it all too well. My father was a dishwasher, my mom was a seamstress and a factory worker, so I know what that feels like when your parents are out of a job. But the highest concentration of these workers, of low-wage workers, are in my district. in Panorama City, in North Hills, and parts of Van Nuys. So it's not about romanticizing poverty, and it certainly isn't about, it's about ensuring that they have the ability to support their families, and that children are not raising themselves, that there's parents present after 5 o'clock, that they get home and spend time with their kids. So the Valley's...
Please, let's just refrain.
The Valley has a very interesting history, because the reason we moved to the Valley was because there used to be high-paying jobs there. I was very, very fortunate that when I was 15, my mom got a factory job that paid almost $13 an hour in the 1980s. That's all gone. So now we have a number of service workers living in the San Fernando Valley who are barely making ends meet. So to me, this is very real. This is not about another study. This is not about another statistic. This is about people who I represent every single day that are having a very difficult time getting by. But I wanted to ask a question, and this is for the Berkeley group. Can you just elaborate on the impacts of the city's GDP and the job growth, and how it fits in the state's estimates of the GDP and the job growth? I just want to figure out if LA is in sync with the state's GDP and job growth rate.
I think if I understand your question, we were looking at GDP figures that come from official statistics and employment as well, and projections from a number of forecasters, including the Beacon Economics forecast. And so we looked at the effect, the kind of negative effect that the higher prices would have on spending, not on total spending, but on sales per unit sales. And therefore that might lead to some job loss and some reduction in GDP. GDP is just level of economic activity. At the same time, on the other side of the ledger, we also have to look at the benefits from the increased spending that, say, people in your district would spend either in the district or outside LA or nearby. And we ran that through what's called a regional input-output multiplier or model, and calculated a multiplier, and that generated for us the positive effects. And we were careful to take into account that the increased income of those who have higher minimum will get higher wages, will be diminished by taxes and by lower public benefits, because some won't be getting food stamps or as much from food stamps, say, as before. And when we netted all that out, we came with a small effect on employment and GDP. I think it's 0.1% of the city's GDP, and that's probably a similar effect on employment, and compared that to what Beacon was projecting for growth, say, of employment, which I think was 2.4% or something of that sort, or 1.8%. I'm kind of filled with numbers in my head right now too. But,
so what I'm trying
but in any case, it was very small compared to, so we decided that in the end, some of the costs of the policy and the benefits, the spending benefits, just about balanced each other out, at least at this level of the minimum wage, and given the percent of workers who commute out, who live outside the city and would spend outside the city.
Do you want to respond to that?
Well, I mean, obviously we have different results. My only response is I want to go back to one of my first comments, which, council member, I appreciate your concern for your constituents. I and the business community share your concern. I would point out that this minimum wage hike would not benefit all your constituents. Half who work outside the city would not be benefited by this, but they would suffer adversely from higher housing costs and the higher cost of living that would be generated by this in the city. And we also have to worry about those folks who would end up actually losing their jobs or have their hours cut. Ultimately, I go back to the idea that the question here is not whether or not we try to help these people. It's what is the best way of trying to help these people. And that's all I need to say.
And I also had a question. I guess I'm going to cite this was something in the Beacon report, and you state that the Berkeley study does not analyze the effects of the reduced profits resulting from this wage increase. But beyond businesses closing or moving, how does this affect growth and expansion, or starting a new business? How would that impact? How would that be impacted by an increase of minimum wage?
Right. Well, Berkeley didn't talk about the impact on profits.
But they didn't analyze the...
Right. But what they did was they assumed a full pass-through of the increase in labor costs to the price of the goods being sold by the firm. So they assumed a full pass-through effect, which to us seems odd. I don't know how you can assume that there's not some competition between companies on two sides of a city border. Ultimately, the impacts on growth come from really what I would call three distinct parts. One part will be businesses, again, moving towards a less labor-intensive production process. Go back to my McDonald's example, more capital, fewer workers. Part two is going to be the fact that businesses who are going to open new establishments here in the County of Los Angeles, particularly if they were thinking about areas that are close to a border, will have the natural incentive to locate their business outside the city boundaries rather than inside any boundaries. So the growth of new businesses will get pushed outside of city borders. Not all, but some. And then last but not least, probably the smallest proportion of the impact will be actually businesses deciding to get up and move outside the city boundaries in order to avoid those minimum wage costs. That might be true specifically for, say, construction companies and other companies that are a little bit more footloose in terms of where they operate out of.
Did you want to respond?
Yeah. In the Beacon report, when they referred to problems with the Berkeley study, they're referring to problems that they saw in our August report. And by the way, they mischaracterized those quite a few times, but they don't apply at all to the current study. We allow profits to fall because sales fall, so that means the volume of profits will fall. On the other hand, if spending increases because of increased wages, that means the amount by which sales fall is actually very small. So I think that's how we analyze the profits. We don't make any fixed assumption about what will happen to profits. We let the data calculate that for us. I've already spoken about the mobility, the border issue, but mechanization is something that often is also brought up in this context. And again, it sounds, what could be more logical than if you raise the price of low-wage workers, you're going to substitute away from low-wage work and put in more equipment to mechanize. And by the way, I'm all for mechanization and growth of productivity. I would never want to restrict that. But, I've talked to people in the industry, in Walmart and McDonald's too, and McDonald's has been trying to go to an iPad approach for years. It's just a very top-down corporation that's having a lot of trouble mechanizing. You just can't assume that because something sounds logical that will happen in the real world. In any case, there is a new study from the Chicago Fed also that looks at what happens in restaurants, not just fast food, when minimum wages go up, what happens to the degree of mechanization. And what happens is that the jobs that are mechanized, they're automated, are the routine jobs, like a cashier jobs, because some companies are using iPads in their restaurants or iPad equivalents, that's fine. And but they don't reduce the number of jobs overall, they increase the number of jobs that can't be automated. So they instead put their money into the food prep, assembling the hamburger, say, or something that a robot still can't do very well. And that doesn't mean it won't ever be a robot who can do it, but for the time being, that's the direction in which the technical change goes. And so net effect on jobs, and this is from not my study, but the Chicago Federal Reserve study, is that mechanization actually doesn't reduce the number of jobs, even fairly low skill jobs. So it's not that it's impossible. Of course, for centuries, mechanization has destroyed a lot of routine jobs, but it's also created a lot of jobs at the same time, and otherwise we'd have no jobs left. The tractor, when it was introduced, mechanized agriculture and eliminated huge amounts of jobs, and agriculture is our main source of employment. Now, agriculture is maybe 3% of total employment. It doesn't mean that we don't have unskilled jobs anymore, right? So it's a bit more complicated than just taking, oh yeah, we're all going to lose our jobs because some robot's going to take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Did you want to respond?
I just really quickly, I mean, it's kind of a surprising viewpoint from my perspective because I think there's a pretty broad agreement that when you think about the tough times that low-skilled workers are having today in the U.S. economy, the fact that their wages in many ways have been flat for years, it's largely due to mechanization that's reduced demand for low-skilled workers. It certainly isn't a supply issue because we know the supply of skilled workers has risen much faster.
Yeah. See, that's where you don't know the research.
I'm sorry,
Dr.
finish, if I
Thornburg.
may.
Well, no, I think the research is clear that the number of low-skilled jobs has been increasing. It's the middle-level jobs that have been falling away. And if you read the work of David Otter and other people, I think that's a consensus in the profession. It's not true that the number of unskilled jobs has been falling. That's not the case.
Okay. Anyway, that's a technical debate we can have another time.
It's not a technical debate. It kind of gets to this question of what is the effect of the minimum wage and using the evidence.
Reasonable minds will differ, apparently, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
The only other thing I wanted to say is obviously there is this issue having to do with, shall we say, increases in spending and the positive benefits that can have on the economy. But I go back to the idea that kind of cost-benefit analysis is being done at a county level. Remember that half the workers who receive this pay increase don't live in the city, they live outside, and that's where the majority of this new spending will occur. So in many ways, it's businesses in the city who will see higher price, reduced businesses, and reduced profits, whereas businesses outside the city who will benefit from those increases in spending. So in a very real sense, I want you to sort of distinguish between the idea of what is good for the broader county economy versus what's good for the city economy, because those are distinctly different questions, given that this is a city-level minimum wage.
We agree on that, by the way. So just to tell you, I'm not kind of automatically disagreeing with
All right, that's a start. Any other comments, members, this time? One last question. You all mentioned the importance of monitoring the impact of the minimum wage increase. Can you elaborate on how, again, for our information, elaborate how you think the city could best do that? In terms of monitoring, in terms of measuring impact?
I was going to say that Daniel had lots of great suggestions on that. Taxable sales is a very quick, easy way of looking at that. We, of course, working with the LA Chamber, have basically are in the process of collecting a business-by-business employment data for the city. That puts us in a unique position of being able to specify very specific industries, or even, actually, we could even come up with groups of specific companies, put them together and create almost an index, if you will, of employment for potentially hard-in industries. But you had another suggestion as well, jobs and taxable sales and looking at wages itself, which that's a little bit lagged. That's the only problem with that.
Yes, we put out, I think, half a dozen data sources for those three measures and also suggest an additional layer of modeling. The most similar economies are the balance of the county and the state, but none of them are just like LA City. And so we suggest some lower limits on deviation in the city's economy from those comparison economies, and some additional tools for understanding negative variation if it occurs. But a lot of that data is available very quickly. Sales tax data comes in quarterly, so some of that you can begin tracking very quickly.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to add that I've been in discussion with some of my colleagues at the Anderson Business School at UCLA, and also a colleague at UC Irvine with whom I'm often paired with, as being on opposite sides of these debates, and we've been trying to brainstorm about how the effects could be monitored for employment. And I think the city actually could play a role here, the city council or the mayor's office, in requesting the state employment development department to release data that's just for the city, for public use, and could be confidentialized and so forth, for research purposes, but to do it on a much faster basis. Right now, that data often comes out with a year lag, and also there is so-called micro data that we would love to have, and we could drill down much deeper. And again, it's up to the city. It's up to the EDD to release this data. They will, in response to requests from a city like Los Angeles. So you could have a big role in improving the monitoring of the jobs effects.
If I may, we already collect that data, and we'd be happy to help, as the case may be.
Thank you. Councilman Cedillo.
Very interesting discussion. What are your thoughts? I've got some questions, but just also interested in some of your thoughts. So I was appreciative that somebody finally could begin to put a number around what a small business is, and you began to have that discussion. Could anybody give me a number on job loss and how it relates to the different proposals that are before us? Can each of you give me an answer to what the number, the raw number of job loss would be according to your assessments?
Yeah, our number at 1325 in 2017 is a job loss in the city of 1,552 jobs, which is accumulated over 3 years, not every year. And that would be 0.1% of all employment in the city. And if you look at the county as a whole, then that would instead become an increase of 3,666 jobs in 2017. So those are the numbers we've come up with for that year.
Our estimate was that, again, a baseline of about 150,000 jobs created in LA over the next 5 years, given just some basic trend forecasting we put together, and that would reduce that from anywhere to 80,000 new jobs to 10,000 new jobs. It's a relatively wide range. Again, because we put that degree of uncertainty in there because candidly we're not, this idea of doing it within a city like LA is so unique, and the increases we're talking about are so large. So it's a broad range.
Okay.
Our view is that it's extremely difficult to model these numbers reliably. It's very dynamic. What's happening in the overall economy will influence it. It's possible the losses could be very, very modest, such as Berkeley is suggesting. It's possible that the stimulus effects could outweigh cost to businesses. And so that's the basis for our recommendation that the city go into it with its eyes open and have tools for monitoring it year by year.
Okay. Thank you. So you don't have a number, though?
No, I don't.
I'm interested in your thoughts on the lack of housing supply being a factor in raising housing costs in the city of Los Angeles.
I guess that's directed to me.
No, all three of you.
Yeah. This housing's been a big issue of mine for many years now, even in the midst of the housing crisis, when foreclosures were going through the roof and home prices were plummeting. California still had the second lowest vacancy rate in the nation. That vacancy rate situation is even more acute now. Basically, if you ask the question, how far back can you go, over the last 20 years, California, which has had 12% of the nation's population, has built approximately 8% of the new housing units in the nation. That is an abysmally low number.
What's the relationship of the new stock or the stock to population is the question.
I'm not sure if I understand.
Right. So what's the relationship of the supply or lack of supply to the housing costs?
Right. So if you have a situation where, say, for example, we worry about a lot of these families because they can't afford housing, it eats up a tremendous amount of their income. I mean, many of the people are working poor because of the cost of housing, and that's a huge issue they have to face. The problem here is if you give people some sort of subsidy, whether it's a subsidy for housing or a pay increase, whatever the case may be, but you don't increase the supply, most of that increase just simply serves to push up prices. And ultimately, who ends up gaining from that increase in demand is the landlords who receive more for their rental properties, as the case may be. So ultimately, the idea of a living wage becomes a moving target. From our perspective, one of the best things that the city can do to help the working poor is to figure out how to expand the supply of existing housing, whether through densification, zoning rules, or just relaxation or modifications to the existing CEQA laws that cause so many developments to be stalled for years at a time.
Okay. Sir?
We've done separate studies for the city around housing issues, and in particular, we've done a large study to support adoption of an affordable housing benefit fee so that new development would contribute funding to offset the additional demand for affordable housing in the city that's generated by the new jobs that come to the city. We're concerned that there is an acute lack of funding and financial tools for supporting the development of affordable housing. We agree that that inventory has grown far more slowly than demand, and the tools for funding affordable housing have virtually disappeared. One benefit is the city's rent stabilization ordinance, which slows down rent increases on much of the city's rental housing stock.
Sir?
Yeah, I would say the minimum wage is not a panacea for all the problems the city has. The city, I'm sure, wants to improve its educational system, housing, transit, infrastructure, and so on. And these are all interconnected and need to be addressed through a variety of policies. And I don't see the minimum wage as really the solution to, or even that much of a problem for the housing stock.
The USC produced a study shortly after these initiatives were brought forth that said that the residents of LA need to make $33 an hour to afford the average apartment. Your thoughts on that? Anyone?
Yeah, that's why I think you're looking at minimum wage proposals, because that you have a city with low wages and relatively high housing cost, not just housing costs, cost of living in general.
Okay. Sir?
I was just going to suggest that we had to be careful about comparing apples and oranges. I mean, obviously, you're talking about the median apartment, and which is a whole scale of apartments from lower to higher in terms of rents, and we're comparing the cost of what you need to earn to afford the median apartment, and we're comparing that to, candidly, the working poor, the lowest paid among us. So in a sense, we got to be a little careful about that specific comparison. But the point is relevant. The numbers we have suggest that something on the order of 50% of households who rent in the city of Los Angeles have spent more than 35% of their income on housing. So it's a significant number. There's no doubt about it.
It's 65% of our population.
We agree that the higher wage will help, but certainly not solve the affordable housing problem. That many households will remain rent burdened and unable to obtain adequate housing and meet all of their other household costs.
Since the early 90s, at different points in time, the state has offered a manufacturer investment credit. The argument that subsidizing manufacturing would create more efficiency, more productivity, and be both good for the economy and create more jobs. It appears that some of the arguments today seem to be contrary to that. What are your thoughts on the state's policy in the past around the manufacturing investment credit?
I know that there's a variety of tax credits out there, and there's an R&D tax credit, I think. A lot of the devil is in the details in these things. As to you want to make sure that companies that we're going to invest anyway aren't getting a credit just because they now can claim one. You want to design the policy to target increases in investment, not levels of investment. Increases beyond what would have happened otherwise. And I don't really want to generalize as to what the effects of these have been in the past. And also, I don't see them as substitutes for increasing the minimum wage. More generally, states have competed with each other by giving tax credits, and the result is pretty much of a zero-sum game where, it doesn't really affect the location of manufacturing that much. And whatever gain one state does make is at the expense of a state where the jobs came from.
In my perspective, again, I can't weigh in specifically on the policy because it depends what you're talking about, but I would like to point out that the manufacturing is actually doing pretty well here in California. Not all industries, but some are, and indeed it's doing well in the United States, but it's doing well with fewer and fewer workers. Again, thinking towards the idea of mechanization, using computers and information technology to do jobs that people used to do. Nowhere is that impact more intense than in manufacturing. So we might consider different ways of trying to boost the manufacturing sector here in Los Angeles, but ultimately I don't think that's going to have a big impact on the labor market just because of the way modern manufacturing is working nowadays.
Los Angeles has lost between 2 and 3% of its manufacturing jobs every year. I'd make a distinction between durable and non-durable manufacturing. The more capital-intensive durable manufacturing industries pay considerably higher wages and are more sustainable for their workers. I also think there are a variety of tools potentially that can help manufacturing industries other than direct subsidies, and a lot of times that entails kind of listening to them, but transportation infrastructure investments that make it easier to move goods in and out can sometimes be very beneficial for industry sectors, and things other than tax subsidies or other mechanisms like that.
It's been argued today that half the benefits of the raise of the minimum wage would go to people who live outside the city. What strategies do you suggest for the city to capture that increase, those resources, that income? And is it true necessarily that while people may live outside the city, does their consumption of goods and services take place where they reside necessarily?
So just two points on that. One is, I think that the point that was mentioned earlier, that if Los Angeles makes the step of establishing its own minimum wage, it's clearly in the interest of the city to also talk with and encourage surrounding cities and the county as a whole to do a similar policy, because just as Los Angeles raising the wage would bring up workers' wages who live outside the city of Los Angeles, so if those other cities raise their minimum wage, that would affect workers inside Los Angeles. So that coordination is important. On the question of how much do commuters spend within the city they commute to, clearly they do spend money, clearly, and that's going to be more if you're in a central city area where people are coming in for sports or entertainment or other things. We have not found good research that quantifies that, so we were reluctant to put it into our estimates. And but that is something that is clearly there. It's a question of how much that is.
Suggestions on how we recapture this revenue that would move outside the city?
Well, our view is that it's going to be a dynamic situation, not a static situation, that first of all, there are similar campaigns in other cities, and we think there's a real possibility that businesses in neighboring cities will need to raise wages to be competitive with wages in Los Angeles. So I think it's hard to know with certainty going in exactly how it's going to play out. I think it's another reason for the city to have tools for monitoring the effects and keeping its eyes open throughout this process.
Sir?
Mechanisms, I think it's true that most people spend most of their money close to their home. I'm sure obviously some of the spending will come into the city. Of course, conversely, some of the people who, well, anyway, how do you recapture that? I haven't really thought through that. It's an interesting idea. My fear is, though, it's very hard to do that, unless, of course, the cities around us do follow suit, which remains to be seen. Many of these cities may very well feel this LA city minimum wage is the best thing that happened to them from a business development standpoint if my fears about business location decisions comes true.
I think the cities in California that have raised their minimum wage or are about to raise their minimum wage should band together and form a coalition of mayors and city councils and go to Jerry Brown and go to Sacramento and say, hey, we're saving you all this money in public benefits, in Medicaid spending, and the feds in food stamps. How about giving us some of it back? And I don't know that Jerry Brown will listen to you, but I think it's worth asking the question. It speaks right to your point about how to recapture the benefits that are lost.
And just to note on that specifically, one of the things we do discuss in our report is the issue of nonprofits that rely on set state funding for reimbursement rates, child care, services to people with developmental disabilities. And one of the clear asks is for those reimbursement rates to be increased to enable people to pay that higher wage. And then that is money that comes back into the local economy. And just to make a note on why that's so important, these are services that have historically had low wages, high turnover, and very well documented evidence of the impact of those low wages and high turnover on quality of service and what that means for both kids and consumers of those services. So there's a strong public policy interest in raising those wages, but in order to do that, there has to be resources there to do it. And so I know the city has already taken the step of going to the state and asking for those increase in reimbursement rates, and that's a very important step, and I commend you on doing that. And that is, I think the argument there that you're saving the state a significant amount of money is a good one to use in those discussions.
I appreciate that. I regret to inform you that the federal level, we are facing for the third straight year incredible cuts from HUD to the city of Los Angeles and the many nonprofits that service our work source centers, that service our some of our training schools. Coming from the Obama administration, it's very disconcerting. I think we're at 30, maybe headed towards 50% in cuts accumulatively over the last 3 cycles, I believe. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Krikorian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just follow up on that last point on reimbursement rates, because this is pretty key. Mr. Cedillo, Mr. Price, myself, and Mr. Koretz spent a considerable amount of our professional careers in Sacramento trying to stop cuts to medical care for poor children and things like that. So if the notion is that we can recapture some of this by going to Jerry Brown and asking him, I think that's an ill-advised notion. The truth is, those nonprofits that are providing life-saving services to people are going to provide fewer of those life-saving services if they have to pay more in wages. And there is no, because their reimbursement rates are not going to be changed. Until pigs fly, their reimbursement rates will not be changed. And so we're really pie in the sky dreaming if we think that by changing the minimum wage, we're going to be able to go to the governor and say, well, now we need higher reimbursement rates. It ain't going to happen. And so transitional jobs at Homeboy Industries and places like that, jobs for the developmentally disabled right now, and for the people who care for the developmentally disabled, there's going to be a downward pressure on those because there isn't going to be the funding to pay for it. And I would love to hear if there are best practices that have been applied in some other city as to how we can address that problem of the impact on transitional jobs and nonprofit jobs, because it is not a feasible solution to expect that there's going to be more funding coming in. There's going to be less, not more. And so how we address that is something that I'm actually very, very concerned about. So are there examples of other ordinances that have been done in a way that won't impact those transitional and nonprofit jobs?
The one real example we have on this is in San Francisco, where they set up a program called Sea Wages, where the City and County of San Francisco created a program to subsidize the wages of child care providers so that they could meet those higher minimum wage laws. And so they addressed it very directly. There's a number of cities have done things like exempt summer youth employment programs. But pretty much for the others, it's been across the board, and folks and people have been included. As we're getting to higher wage levels, this does create some other set of issues. And the big concern here is if you exempt childcare, you exempt developmental disability services, and their wage levels fall farther behind the market, that's going to increase that job turnover, and that's going to have other effects on quality of care. And so I think it is incumbent to look at where and how do you find the resources to help move towards resolving a problem, which has been a long-standing problem, and I know some of you have addressed those and worked on those throughout your, in your careers.
Okay.
I would comment that the nonprofit sector is very diverse.
Yes.
USC is a nonprofit. Children's Hospital is a nonprofit. Chamber of Commerce is a nonprofit. County
Kaiser.
Federation of Labor. The Economic Roundtable is a nonprofit. We don't pay taxes, and the quid pro quo is we're supposed to benefit the public. So I think that there is a moral burden on nonprofits that their workers be able to have a minimally decent life. And I think the nonprofits that have reimbursement rates set by the state or the federal government are a really small slice of the overall nonprofit sector. So if that's an area of concern, those carve-outs need to be very, very specific and not broad.
And that's kind of my point. So are there examples where something like that has been effectively done that we can learn from?
I don't know of another example other than San Francisco's, and the complexity around carve-outs is it's very difficult even to establish the number of workers at a business because it may fluctuate during the year. So you take the low count, you take the high count. It's very difficult to pin down precisely the industry that an establishment is in. So enforcing carve-outs is a very complex problem.
Right. So that brings me to my next point on this. We talked about small businesses, and one of the concerns that I have is wherever you draw that line, whether it's 4 employees or 100 employees, especially in industries where a large percentage of the employees are minimum wage employees or being paid less than what our proposed increase would be, there is a significant disincentive to hiring above that level. So for anybody if you're at 99 employees, you're not going to hire that 100th employee because it's going to cost you so much in raising the entire workforce's wages. So are there other models that other cities have used that mitigate that impact? Maybe it's instead of number of employees, maybe it's setting a number of minimum wage employees or a number of employees below the larger threshold, or is there some other way that we can do that so that we don't have I think everybody agrees we don't want with our good intentions to actually hurt workers and hurt people who are seeking jobs right now. So is there some way that we can mitigate that and still define small employer in a way that won't create that problem?
Well, we have an appendix that looks at all of the ordinances of cities that have adopted minimum wage ordinances, and by and large, very few have exemptions or carve-outs. So for the most part, the ordinances are applied across the board. I believe San Francisco has a mechanism for case-by-case review of businesses that see hardships. So again, enforcing carve-outs is a difficult problem.
Okay. Mr. Kretz raised the important point of wage theft, and the Economic Roundtable study found that 30% of low-wage workers get less than the minimum wage because of varying kinds of wage theft. I think we all agree that should be job number one, to try to remedy that problem so that we're not making the hole deeper that we're trying to dig our way out of because of wage theft. What do each of you think about the risk that problem is exacerbated and we create more of a black market economy if the minimum wage gets to some certain level? And I'm not saying that that would occur from these proposals, but is there some minimum wage level that we should be concerned about where it creates more of a black market economy and causes worsening wage theft?
Yeah, again, that's a argument that sounds logical, that the problem will get worse because there's a greater incentive for employers to pay people off the books or cheat and so forth. But in fact, when you look at the data, as I have, again, in San Francisco, when San Francisco's minimum wage went up by 28% over the states, we looked in parts of the city where there was more likely to be wage theft, in the Latino and Chinatown areas in particular, and we found the same wage increases as in other parts of the city. When we compare administrative data where employers say what they're paying, for the UI tax purposes, and what employees are saying they're getting when they respond to the current population survey questionnaire, the American Community Survey, and so on, we find the numbers line up pretty well. Not the numbers we're getting, we're not saying there's no wage theft or there's 100% compliance, rather that the wage increase is reported by both employee and employer in about the same amount. So while I agree that wage theft is a problem and should be addressed, I haven't found evidence that it gets worse at higher minimum wages than at lower minimum wages. Because you have a lot of big companies, for example, like McDonald's, that I think are actually highly compliant. They have systems in place. And so, it's not all some shady company. That's a stereotype.
We have a graph in our report. It's kind of hard to take it in from there, but it looks at the share of low-wage workers that are informal in low-wage industries, and the highest rate is in apparel, and low-wage industries already have high levels of informality. So we see that as part of a race to the bottom, and not necessarily something driven by raising the wage floor, but accommodated by lack of enforcement. And so we see enforcement as being part of this, and higher wages not necessarily causing more informality, but rather informality being a companion to very low wages.
I would caution against using San Francisco as an apt metaphor for what might happen here in Los Angeles. To your point, the informal sector in Los Angeles is enormous relative to any place else in the state. A tremendous amount of workers don't show up on the payroll survey. It's hard to get a grasp of exactly what's going on because of all the convolutions of people commuting in and out of the county. But we know it's there. The gap between the household and the payroll statistics tells us that. And I do think there is, under certain circumstances, a very serious potential to push even more workers into that particular arena. If enforcement could help that, obviously enforcement is the way you want to go. But again, we're talking about a much larger population than, say, what you're dealing with in San Francisco. And it's ultimately going to be a very large burden from a regulatory and policing standpoint to deal with that. I mean, you're talking hundreds of thousands of people.
Last one. What percentage of the impacted employees under these proposals receive any kind of non-wage benefits? And if we're only adjusting the wage, what is the risk that those non-wage benefits will be lost to those workers as a way of businesses paying for the higher wage?
Well, generally speaking, the lower the wage, the lower the benefit, the percent getting benefits in the first place. So, right, health and pension benefits. So, there is a risk. There is a risk.
Health care and everything else.
Right. Yeah. So, I don't think you can take away benefits that aren't being given in the first place. So, yeah. Do we have figures on that?
Yeah. So, it's, in terms of health care benefits, it's about a quarter of the workforce that we would be affected by the law that is currently getting health care benefits. And it's important to note the interaction with the Affordable Care Act and the employer responsibility requirements under the Affordable Care Act, because when you drill down, and I know we did this in here, I'd have to pull it out, to say, okay, then how many are there who are firms less than 50, workers less than 30 hours, and then those numbers start getting smaller. So there is some built-in piece that pushes back against the ability to just purely shed benefits. It's also important, and most lower wage workers who are currently getting benefits is because they're in larger firms and firms with higher wage workers. And so that's part of what the overall package that firm has, and given anti-discrimination rules, it's unlikely they're going to change in those areas. And this is a context in which the share of workers with job-based coverage in the United States and in California has fallen by about 10% points over the last decade. It looks to be stabilizing a bit now. But you are operating in that context. So I think ultimately Michael's right that the sort of share that are in that place where it's likely to happen is a smaller share.
Thank you.
Mr. Koretz.
Mr. Chair, I would just point out what was said about San Francisco and wage theft enforcement. I think is skewed a little bit by the fact that San Francisco also has one of the strongest wage theft enforcement programs. And so I don't think we can just assume that we raised the wage and it's not going to have an impact on wage theft. I think, in fact, it will unless we have a state-of-the-art program. And in fact, San Francisco's program absolutely has to be a model for us. And we have to put in something at least that strong, or I think we will exacerbate the problem. I think we could do exactly the opposite and actually get a handle on the problem and get virtually everyone paid their full wage if we put in a San Francisco model.
Any other comments, members? Well, again, let's thank our panelists for their 3 hours of time this afternoon. Again, gentlemen and gentlelady, thank you for your work. And thank you for your guidance as we develop a policy that benefits the people of this city. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move to the public comment portion of this meeting. And let me just say, I understand at one point we had about 400 or 500 people here in the building. Some have left here, some have left other viewing areas around. We're going to reserve 40 minutes for comments and 20 minutes on each side, those in favor, those opposed to the minimum wage, as a way of just focusing our comments. And again, this is not going to be your last or only time to comment. At the end of the meeting, we'll announce the schedule of follow-up community meetings. Yeah, we're going to ask each speaker to hold their comments to 1 minute. And the first panel of speakers, Rusty Hicks, LaFonza Butler, Rita Walters, Councilwoman Rita Walters, and Adam Lane and Luis Mendez. If you will line up at the podium. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Rusty Hicks. I'm the Executive Secretary-Treasurer of the LA County Federation of Labor and the co-convener of the campaign to raise the wage. This has been a great discussion this afternoon, but I think the question before you is really a simple one. Is it good or bad that nearly 750,000 people in this city don't make enough to live on? Is it good or bad that 8 in 10 low-wage workers experience some form of wage theft? Is it good or bad that 4 out of 5 low-wage workers in the healthcare, hospitality, and service industries serve other people but have to make a decision between going to work sick or keeping their job? Today I stand on behalf of hundreds of thousands of hardworking Angelenos to call for and ask for a comprehensive policy to lift families out of poverty so that they can not only survive but thrive and move our economy forward. So let's raise the wage to $15 an hour. Let's enforce that wage and give people earned sick pay.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you. Please hold your applause. It just takes away from our time here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, all of the participants, the council people. I want to commend you for undertaking this debate and this finding of fact and weighing all of the options. It seems to me pretty clear that Los Angeles will never move forward without increasing its minimum wage and peg it to something and keep increasing it as the years go on. When I represented the 9th Council District, it was a district of deep poverty. It was not including downtown. Downtown was part of that at the time. But I tell you, out in the more residential areas than downtown, grocery stores, people were struggling to make enough money to put food on the table, and then they would go to a neighborhood store, and the food was not fit to eat, not fit to buy, but yet it cost as much as if you went to some other part of the city. I hear that buzzer, I see the zeros, it's time, but please, pass this resolution. I hope you pass it at the $15.25 level and then tie it to the rate of increase that it needs for the future years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Please.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is LaFonza Butler. I serve as president of SEIU United Long-Term Care Workers and president of SEIU California. I also work as a co-convener of the Raise the Wage campaign, and today I stand before you not to engage in the age-old debate of business versus labor, but really to talk about the real question before us, which is about our future. It's about the humanity and indeed the soul of the city we all want to live in and create for our children and grandchildren. Whether our workers are serving in the best restaurants or in neighborhood bars or cleaning floors in our iconic office buildings, we all want a city where those very workers aren't going home to be served in soup kitchens and food pantries. We all want a city where working men and women who provide world-renowned health care can be served themselves by working to make sure that they have sick days, earned sick days. Let's pass a comprehensive policy here in Los Angeles to create the city that we want.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Council. My name is Adam Lane. I'm here on behalf of the Los Angeles Business Council in support of a citywide increase in the minimum wage to $13.25 by 2017. The LABC is an organization with over 400 members from multiple business sectors, including nonprofit, manufacturing, engineering, construction, finance, healthcare, education, real estate, and energy, amongst others. In a vote of our entire membership, the LABC agreed to support the minimum wage proposal as part of a broader economic strategy for the City of LA. This strategy includes the mayor's goal of creating 100,000 new units by 2021, growing the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, cutting red tape at City Hall to expedite the permitting process near public transit hubs, combined with further reductions in the gross receipts tax, which we're very happy to have seen already steps taken. We believe the minimum wage increase will have a benefit for the workers of Los Angeles and a multiplying impact on the economy through an increase in aggregate earnings of $1.8 million annually. We recognize that solely an increase in minimum wage will not cure the housing crisis in the city. Increasing the minimum wage should be a part of a comprehensive approach that aims to increase housing supply. While we support $13.25, we do not support an increase to $15.25. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next panel of speakers, Gary Tobin, David England, Carol Schatz, Rick Norden, and Sarah Mitchell.
Members of the council, my name is Gary Tobin. I'm with the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce. Our first presenter today talked about this being a bold proposal. And I think your job is to decide whether it is bold like D-Day or bold like the Titanic. For thousands of small businesses in Los Angeles, this policy is the Titanic. It will sail off with a celebration, and it will steer their businesses towards an iceberg. Businesses will not be able to increase the cost of their products and services to cover a 50% increase over 3 years and a 70% increase in wages over 5 years. And whatever the price increase is, it won't just affect the wealthy. It'll affect everyone in this room. The end result of increasing the minimum wage 50% in 3 years and 70% in 5 years will be a reduction in the growth of jobs in our community and a reduction in tax revenue for the city. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm David England with the Los Angeles County Business Federation. We're an alliance of 130 top business groups, and we represent 88,000 employers here in the city of Los Angeles. There's so much to comment on, but I'll keep it to this key point. We share your concern about addressing poverty in the city, but this will not solve poverty. These minimum wage increases proposals just won't do that. A full-time job working at even the $15 an hour wage still leaves the worker deeply below the poverty line. So if you care about poverty, this is clearly not the solution. A better solution would be for City Council to focus on creating the conditions that promote good-paying middle-class jobs, not minimum wage jobs, good-paying middle-class jobs that can actually lift individuals and families out of poverty. Many of those proposals and details are in the Beacon report, so we'd like to associate ourselves with that as well, particularly dealing with the housing issue. If you care about poverty, there are other things you need to do, not this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Carol Schatz, President of Central City Association. We represent over 500 companies employing over 350,000 people in the region. We were the first business organization to support the mayor's proposal, but with significant conditions. We need, foremost, to have a longer phase-in to get to 1325, not 1537. And we need to do that to protect small businesses and nonprofits like the one I run, a business improvement district in addition to CCA, so they have time to adapt. Exemptions aren't going to help the nonprofits. We adopted the Seattle approach. The phase-in was 4 years for companies with 500 plus employees, 7 years for nonprofits and smaller business of less than 500 employees. A lower wage scale for teenage and transitional workers entering the job market. You want to protect teenage jobs, not destroy them. And the city must work with Sacramento to include tips, commissions, health care pension, and other benefits so the minimum wage proposal can focus on total taxable compensation and deal with the real poverty issues and not middle-class salaries. Don't put an additional burden on business. You must phase in a much longer schedule so this can work for everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Rick Nordine, and I'm a small businessman just representing myself. I want to say this is a morally right discussion, but it's functionally wrong. It's functionally wrong because it's the wrong body discussing this. This needs to be an issue that goes beyond the city of Los Angeles. It needs to be something that is a county, a state issue, and that's where we need leadership from this group, not to carve out something just for LA. Secondly, as an economic development committee, we need to worry about not discussing job loss, but job growth. For too many decades, we've been hemorrhaging jobs in this region, and we've got to get the conversation back on job growth issues. I have two neighbors who are trying to start a business, and I asked them a couple weeks ago, how's it going? And they're immigrants from another country. And they said, well, it's going really slow. And so before I came here today, I asked them, well, how's it going now? And they said, well, you know, we're Frenchmen. We would have stayed in France because it's easier to start a business in France than in Los Angeles. Now, that's a problem. We need to get things working here for everybody, and a minimum wage is just part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, council members. I'm Sarah Mitchell. I'm with the Valley Industry and Commerce Association. We represent 400 businesses in the city and surrounding area. We appreciate that you took the time to hear from all of our researchers, but it would be a disservice to businesses and Angelinos if you were to go ahead and call the UC Berkeley study the end-all, be-all opinion on the effects that this hike would have on our city and region. The study claims that there will be no ripple effect or wage compression to make an impact, even though this has been a huge concern with all of our businesses, especially the ones who already voluntarily pay above the minimum wage in order to be competitive. It's ignorant to assume that those making $13 or $15 now are not going to demand increases as well. There's not been a large enough discussion as well to talk about the increases that will be beyond that due to parallel increases in workers' compensation and other labor needs. We're worried that proponents are looking at this proposal as it is just a $4 to $6 increase per hour per employee. That is only part of the puzzle. We need our elected officials to look at the full spread of costs instead of relying on their predetermined positive results from UC Berkeley. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next panel of speakers, Reverend Thomas Clary, Pastor Bertie Roberts, Kevin Litwin, Dave Garcia, and Hector Villagra.
Good afternoon. My name is Father Tom Carey. I'm with Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice. My brothers and sisters on the committee, I'm here to urge that you pass a law which allows for a $15.25 minimum wage with enforcement. You know, the great temptation of the market economy is to treat people as units of production or units of commerce and not as human beings. And it's a temptation that we as a society fall prey to. People are not units of production. They are not units of commerce. And if we ignore that, we incur many, many other costs, and they're costs that you already know about. To begin, this minimum wage allows us to redress an inequality that is endemic in our society. There is a sea of workers out there who know that they are getting a raw deal. The great Patrick Henry said that there is a just God who presides over the destiny of nations. The just God that presides over the destiny of this city is the one which will cause us to pay the consequences of our inaction.
Thank you, Father.
So I thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Pastor Bridie Roberts. I'm the program director at CLU Los Angeles. For 12 years, it's been my privilege to work in this city on the fight to improve the conditions for working families in our community. Many of you have been a part of that fight. At every turn where I have encountered workers who are working full-time at minimum wage or less than $15 an hour, they are living in dire situations of poverty and making choices that no family should have to make. Will the rent be paid this month? Will we be able to keep the lights on? What does health insurance look like? Will I be able to have a daycare provider? These are the real costs and questions of what poverty looks like in our city, and the ripple impacts on our community is for generations to come. I ask you today to not just be bold in the context of a $13 an hour minimum wage hike, but to push harder, to imagine a better Los Angeles. A Los Angeles for $15 seems like too little, but that's where we'll start, and enforcement is part of the package. We have an opportunity to invest in our future, in our children, in our community, so that we say that Los Angeles is a world-class city that leads the rest of the country, and that pushes forward. And I would be remiss if I didn't just take one moment to say, as pastor and chaplain in this labor movement of workers, that while I really appreciated the in-depth reporting that we received and found it extraordinarily helpful, it saddens me that the more than 100 workers that were here and took time off their paid workplace, unpaid, to come and share their thoughts, had to leave because of the length of the meeting. So I hope that in future moments we have real opportunities for workers to share their testimony.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Dave Garcia. I'm the Director of Policy for the Los Angeles LGBT Center. I think there's a fallacy that the LGBT community is somehow richer, that we have more resources or more money. That is not true. Gay men make less than straight men. Lesbians make less than their straight counterparts, and the transgender community is hurting economically more than anybody. The Los Angeles LGBT Center is a nonprofit. In fact, we're the largest LGBT organization in the world with 500 employees, over 6 buildings in Hollywood, as many of you know. Gay or straight, you got to eat. And we support our friends and allies in labor who are here, especially, and we encourage you to raise the wage. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, members of the council and members of the public. My name is Kevin Litwin. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Joe's Parking here in downtown Los Angeles. We oversee about 20,000 parking stalls here alone. I'm here to support the findings of the Economic Roundtable report. I think it's eye-opening that almost 250,000 Angelinos in poverty work and 55% of their income goes to rent, and throw in the fact that Los Angeles is one of the most expensive cities to live in. The report also mentions that 75% of low-wage jobs are face-to-face or need to be close to customer base, so they simply won't go away with an increase. We support the $15.25 an hour, wage enforcement, and paid sick time. We believe it's time Los Angeles sets the example, lights up the beacon in City Hall to represent saying no more to unfair wage scales. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Hector Viagra, and I'm Executive Director of the ACLU of Southern California. The ACLU strongly supports the Raise the Wage campaign because economic rights are inextricably linked to civil liberties, and because paid sick days and a living wage are important economic and reproductive justice issues. Economic justice is a basic tenet of our organization. A person cannot fully enjoy their civil rights if they can't put food on the table for themselves and their family, or if they don't have a roof over their heads. Reproductive justice means being able to work and take care of yourself and your family. It means not having to choose between tending to the needs of a sick child and keeping the job that is crucial to supporting your family. We are a nonprofit, but we do not support exemptions for nonprofit organizations. We don't think it would make sense. Our employees and other nonprofit employees in Los Angeles face the staggeringly high cost of living that the rest of the city does. Raising the wage will uphold both economic and reproductive justice in our city. That's why I strongly urge you to consider the findings of the Economic Roundtable and raise the wage. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm a small business owner who sells to the restaurant and hospitality industry nationally. So this affects me and my company and all my employees on a national scale. I'm also being nominated for one of the small businesses of the city of LA. I found out yesterday. I'd like to know, because I'm in the city of San Fernando, what benefits I would have by moving my operations to a nice area like Chatsworth. One incentive would you be able to offer once my overhead is raised $200,000 a year in labor? Is your raising the minimum wage going to scare away an important layer of business? I understand that, Councilman Martinez, your folks came here because of manufacturing. It's disappearing. Councilman Cedillo, you mentioned what is happening to manufacturing to the nice Berkeley folks. And Councilman Cedillo wants it. I would like you folks to look at it versus micro, just LA, and how we're going to be competitive against the world and the nation.
Thank you.
How we're going to keep agriculture in California, entertainment, which everyone mentioned Burbank, and not to scare the jobs away, but to bring them to Los Angeles.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nicole Shahinian, Liron Gubler, George Abudad, Laura Pertola, and Paul Kajiara.
Good afternoon, Nicole Shahinian, representing the East Hollywood Business Improvement District. The East Hollywood Business Improvement District has taken a position to conditionally support an increase in the citywide minimum wage, but is adamant that such an increase be coupled with several policy changes aimed at mitigating the negative effects on our small business community. Specifically, we're asking for a longer phase-in period to get to the $13.25. The phase-in of a wage increase should be extended until at least 2020 to give businesses adequate time to plan and hopefully absorb the impacts. Second, the need for comprehensive and immediate reform of the LA business tax. Third, a commitment to the city to advocate for changes to the state's tip earners policies, which we've all talked about this morning already. And four, a carve-out for nonprofit organizations and youth employment. And five, a complete withdrawal of the hotel minimum wage ordinance. The bid maintains that an industry-specific minimum wage aimed at LA's hospitality industry is still bad policy. We look forward to working with you to make this happen for all Angelinos. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm LaRon Gubler, President and CEO of the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce. As we have said repeatedly, this chamber can only support an increase in the minimum wage if steps are taken to ease the impact on small businesses and nonprofit organizations. We have just completed a survey of our own small business sector and have found very different results from the Berkeley study. Let me share a couple of statistics. Our small businesses estimate that if this happens as currently proposed, their total operating expenses will rise by 21% and that their profit margins will decline by about 9%. Such a result would have a major impact on the viability of many small businesses. And I can tell you a lot of our small businesses are running very scared by this proposal as it currently stands. We urge you to consider and to take steps to exempt and or to reduce the impact of the proposal on our small business sector. And I do have copies of the survey results I'd like to share with the committee.
Fine, just give
Thank
it to the officer. Thank you.
Hi, my name is George Abu Daud. I'm a local independent restaurant owner, and I'm here on behalf of many local independent, family, small, minority-owned restaurants, about 100 that were represented outside and weren't allowed into the room because there was overflow, so I'm going to speak on their behalf. I submitted a document early on that everybody got a copy. It's about a 14-page document which has a lot of details in it, so I won't go into detail here. It's signed by over 150 of us independent local restaurants. We support a wage increase when done thoughtfully and with proposed nuances that would ensure our sustainability and maintain jobs for our employees. The restaurant business is widely known for its high rate of failure due to its inability to increase prices to cover all rising costs from all entities, including labor, which averages between 35 to 60%. It's important to note that we already pay above the minimum wage to everyone, and that most people, in fact, all people who are receiving them, I'm sorry, I'm going to keep going because I'm representing too many people that didn't get to speak.
Well,
the non-tipped employees
you're not going to go too long. Just
okay, I won't go too long.
finish up
But
your comment.
our non-tipped employees are the majority of who are getting the minimum wage, and they earn a total compensation that is well in excess of the minimum wage. So our issue is very, very different than everybody in this room. No one here is a local restaurant independent employee that's coming here to protest. This is a 66% increase from 2013 to 2017 over 4 years, and that would be considered catastrophic in any business.
Okay, let's wrap it up, please.
Sorry?
Said wrap up
Okay,
your comments.
so anyway, this is a measure that requires a pen and thoughtful consideration of varying business models, not a sword that blindly slashes through the essence of the fabric of Los Angeles.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments.
Good afternoon. My name is Laura Peralta. I serve as Director of Local Government Relations in Southern California for the California Grocers Association. Our association represents hundreds of local, regional, and national grocery stores in California. Given the importance of the city of Los Angeles as a population center, many of the companies that belong to our association operate here in this city. I'm here this afternoon to express our industry's significant concerns with the proposal before you, which would raise the minimum wage in the city of Los Angeles. Over time, the city's specific requirement could outpace the state's minimum wage by 50%. The difference creates a significant competitive disadvantage for grocery stores located inside the city and logistical challenges for small and large companies operating both inside and outside the city proper. Labor costs represent one of the largest categories of expense for the typical grocer. Increasing those costs will not help store development efforts in Los Angeles. In fact, it will create a disincentive for companies to grow and expand within the city. In addition, many companies currently operating in LA will face serious challenges. We ask that you please consider the following. Allow for a longer phase-in for any increase in the minimum wage, include healthcare, pension, and other benefits in determining total compensation figures, implement a stepped wage increase rather than increases tied to the CPI, allow an exemption for young employees, and lastly, address the issue of difference in pay for employees who work in different locations for a grocery store, both inside and outside the city. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Paul Kajiwara. I'm a regional director of operations for a major restaurant and hospitality company. I wanted to share a perspective, not as a business owner, but someone that's in the trenches every day. And I can tell you what's happening right now. In my company, we're experimenting with larger sections for servers to offset the minimum wage we've already taken. So that's eliminating jobs right there, and that's happening today. What I really urge is that there's not a broad stroke approach to this minimum wage for the simple fact that tipped employees are well and above the minimum wage that you guys are proposing. If you don't consider that as part of whatever you guys choose to put into law, I feel that would be irresponsible, because that money is not going to go to the people you're intending it to go to. If we give those people, the servers, bartenders, who in my region, I have bartenders that make up to $70,000 a year, that minimum wage increase would take them up to $80,000. That money is not going to go to the back of the house dishwashers, line cooks that this money, I feel, is designed to go to. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Byron Tyson, Byron Tyson, Christina Bailey, Ben Rodas, Colleen McKinney, and Jacqueline Mejia. You may begin, sir.
Good afternoon, Councilman. My name is Byron Tyson. I'm the owner of West Window Washing, and I'm also a member of the Los Angeles Black Workers Center. I'm here in support of the findings of the Economic Roundtable report, and I'm asking the City Council to be courageous and raise the minimum wage. I own a small business. I employ fewer than 10 people. I started my business because me trying to get a job, I just couldn't get jobs. I couldn't get hired. I wouldn't get hired, actually. And the jobs I did get, they paid very little. They were low-wage positions. As a member of the Black Workers Center, I'm an advocate of workers in the city who are 50% unemployed or underemployed like I was. Before I started my own business, I was a former window washer, and I earned a wage of $10 an hour. It was very, very difficult for me to support a family of 5. It was next to impossible. So that's why I don't want my employees to go through what I had to go through. The main issue is people just don't have money to spend. I'm sorry, I'm almost done. People don't have money to spend.
Just wrap up if you could.
I pay $15 an hour to my employees because I believe that workers should be paid a fair wage. As a result, my employees are thankful for me, and I'm thankful for them. As a small business owner, I strongly disagree that raising minimum wage would drive business away, and it wouldn't be possible. I just believe it's a greedy excuse. So please, raise the wage. Include all workers by enforcing all workplace laws. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Councilman, Council members. My name is Christine.
Can you move closer to the mic?
Move closer. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm not there yet. I am a small business owner who own a catering company. I hire qualified workers. There is no such thing as low-skilled workers because these workers help me improve what I serve for the community. I support the Economic Roundtable report because it is factual that raising the wage will increase the livelihood of life for all my workers. As a small business owner, I do pay my workers $15 to $17 an hour, and this will and has prevented unstableness and hardships. I am currently working with graduates who are attending UC Santa Barbara that are single-parent households and people who just came out of the jail sector that can't get a job. With raising the minimum wage would not only put money in my pocket, but would put services in Los Angeles that will increase a better life for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Colleen McKinney, Policy and Program Associate at the Los Angeles Food Policy Council. The food industry is a critical employer in our city and our region. 1 in every 7 jobs in Southern California is in the food system, employing about 15% of our workforce. Yet this large segment of the workforce is systemically underpaid. Workers along the food chain are among the most food insecure people in our state, with 23% of food workers receiving SNAP food support in California, as compared with only 11% of the overall population. A national study found that only about 13.5% of food system workers make a living wage, while nearly 40% make poverty wages. By supporting a living wage and discouraging wage theft, the LA City Council can help lift thousands of people working along the food chain out of poverty. The LA Food Policy Council supports a livable wage so that all workers along the food chain, including farm, food manufacturing and distribution, grocery, food service, and restaurant workers, can afford to buy the very food they work so hard to bring to our tables. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Jacqueline Mejia, Policy Advocate. I'm here on behalf of CHIRLA, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles, and its members. CHIRLA is an immigrant rights social justice organization whose mission includes improving the quality of life for our communities. We are a nonprofit organization who understands that raising the minimum wage and including enforcement is a crucial issue which we support. CHIRLA does not support nonprofit exemptions. We believe that we can all adjust for a more just and equitable city. As a leader, CHIRLA has already taken initiative in raising our employees' wages. CHIRLA supports raising the minimum wage with effective enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Benjamin Rodas. I am 17 years old. I attend Ramon C. Cortina School of Visual Arts and Performing Arts. I work at McDonald's in Echo Park. I live by the Westlake MacArthur Park area. I earn wages and I work part-time. I dream to go to college one day. Next year is my last year of high school. All my money goes to help with rent and food and pay phone bills. I work to help my family and save money for college. Most of the youth who work are like me, who we need to work. We're not just working for fun. Please raise the minimum wage for everyone. We are all equal.
Thank you. Okay, our next group of speakers, Ruben Gonzalez, Matt Sutton, Bob Spivak, Scott Ponchetti, and Madeline Alfano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Ruben Gonzalez with the LA Area Chamber of Commerce. I rise to speak on one issue within the minute that I have, the issue of indexing. Now, the idea behind indexing and the intent is a good one. However, in its implementation, it is flawed. It is not the right tool to reach that stated goal. If you look at the 5 years of the Great Recession, 4 out of those 5 years, CPIW, which is what is proposed to index against currently, went up 4 out of those 5 years. So that means that during that time, if this was in place, those businesses that were barely keeping their doors open, barely keeping their employees, having to lay folks off, would have still seen 4 out of those 5 years an increase in their labor costs. That's simply not the right way to go forward when you have an algorithm that can't stop and look at the different variables in the economy and in specific industries that can make things worse. What we need to have is what we're having now: good, solid discussions, policy debate, studies, and our policymakers who are elected to make decisions, making these decisions, not an algorithm that can't take into account all that information. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Bob Spivak. I'm the founder of our restaurant company, Grill Concepts. We have 5 restaurants in the city of Los Angeles. I've been making payroll for over 50 years. Before you pass this minimum wage, I urge you to go to the legislature and fight for a total compensation bill from the state. Other people have talked about the fully compensated people who make more money than just minimum wage. There are salespeople making 6 figures who come under minimum wage. We have over 1,000 servers. We do not have one that makes less than $30 an hour, and they average $35 an hour. These are the people who are going to get minimum wage increases. Other than those people, in the 2,000 team members we have, we do not have one person who's paid minimum wage. Every single person is paid above minimum wage except for the tipped employees. We need total compensation. Several of us spoke with the governor. The governor said if the legislature would give them a bill, he would sign it. I believe Mayor Garcetti is in favor of it, and I urge the council people to go to the state and get us a total compensation bill. Thank you.
Good afternoon, council members and Economic Committee. My name is Scott Ponchetti, and I work for a major restaurant brand that is an international company. I'm the Director of Operations for North America West, and within my region is a cafe in Seattle. This week, actually, or next week, we'll take an 18% increase, and the impact on our business this year alone is $100,000. Price alone cannot combat that. We're already an expensive date. We're reducing one salary manager this year. I've already done that. Unfortunately, one career position. I've reduced 2 hourly janitorial or cleaning crew positions, and I've reduced 20% of my staff's hours to compensate for this. I don't qualify, or our restaurant does not qualify for under 500 employees, so we'll take that increase by 2017. And the impact by 2017 is $300,000. The unfortunate situation is, honestly, again, I can't combat that with price, and our business goes upside down. I face the situation of looking for efficiencies and other opportunities, but I just don't know how I'll overcome that. At the end of the day, we look at our lease in 3 years and say we might have to exit this market. Currently, 115 employees, families, we're talking about young employees entering the market, and that's what I'm faced with looking at here. Please go slow, phase this in, and help businesses stay open so that we can provide jobs. I know Bob just spoke about full compensation. That is the only way that we in the restaurant industry will be able to continue to provide the jobs. Thank you.
Hi there. My name is Madeline Alfano, and I'm the owner of Maria's Italian Kitchen. I've been in business for 30 years, and I was able to sign a birthday card for everyone in March who works at Maria's Italian Kitchen during these hearings. I want to talk about from a personal level. I work with amazing people. I have 400 employees. Many of them have been with me for more than 20 years. Unfortunately, last year we had the minimum wage increase, and I didn't increase my prices because my customers are very price sensitive. We're a casual restaurant. I had to close my downtown restaurant. I had to say goodbye to 50 of my employees. That was a very hard decision for me. I would love to expand the business. I would love to expand in Cedillo's area and Martinez. I know those are underserved communities for restaurants, but the cost to open a restaurant in those communities is the same as anywhere else. I would love to hire more employees and thrive, but the minimum wage increase does affect our industry, and like everyone else said, the tipped employees are the ones that are most highly compensated. My heart of the house employees are so near and dear to me, and I would love for them to get the benefit of any minimum wage that's increased. So please consider the total compensation package.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Good afternoon, Chairman Price and members of the Economic Development Committee. My name is Matt Sutton. I'm with the California Restaurant Association. We had about 40 members here earlier to come and testify. Many of them had to leave and others weren't left in the room, but wanted you to know that they were here. It's a very important issue. For the last 6 months, we've met with many of you. I think we've met with all of you, some multiple times, and definitely appreciate your consideration of the restaurant community and the unique impact that minimum wages can have. You've heard a lot about the tipped wage issue, and I know we've discussed that quite a bit. It's a very real issue, and there's many tipped employees that are making well north of any minimum wage rate that we're talking about here today. So we urge you and encourage you to please pursue that. We do think there's a pathway, and we've provided that, and we're happy to do so again. I think the other issue that's a backdrop to all this, actually I'm running out of time, teen wage, I think you should consider strongly a teen wage. Other cities have done super minimum wages, and San Jose and San Francisco have the highest. They also have the highest youth unemployment. So I think studies show that youth unemployment will raise with super minimum wages because becomes more challenging and it's a risk assessment for operators, will they take a risk on relatively untrained and new employees at such high rates? So with that, I'd encourage you to consider the total compensation piece and tipped wage piece, and certainly, as the economists pointed out, review along the way. Attaching it to CPI puts the wages on autopilot. So I think they all agreed on reviewing this and building in some mechanism.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have Tim McDonald, King Chung, Sydney Ann Ross Rideau, Rafael Ventura, Nicholas Montano, Scott Hartford, Biff Naylor, and Everett Frick.
Good afternoon. My name is King Chung. I am the co-chair of the Chinatown Community for Equitable Development, CCED, a community organization dedicated to working with low-income immigrants on labor and tenant issues. Before my retirement, I used to work at the California Division of Labor Standards Enforcement for 25 years, enforcing the state's wage and hour laws. From my experience, I see the need to raise the minimum wage, strong enforcement against wage theft, and providing paid sick days. Therefore, I strongly agree and support the findings of the Economic Roundtable. Also, I do not see the need for exemptions for nonprofit organizations. Looking at the ones that I know that they will survive and manage. In fact, I feel that they will set an example for all other employers to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name is Sydney Ross Risden. I'm from the Global Women's Strike LA. Women of Color in the Global Women's Strike and Payday Men's Network also helped to prepare the following. That the minimum wage is lower in LA than every other major city in California is a critical issue for women. Women are the majority of minimum waged workers. Women make up almost 2/3 of the people who are employed in waged work but still live in poverty, disproportionately women of color and single mothers. Women and children also have been hit especially hard by the economic downturn and the dismantling of welfare as a right and other safety net programs. Single mothers and our children are the fastest growing population of homeless in LA County. Mothers who are homeless risk having our children removed by the LA Department of Children and Family Services. 40% of families headed by women in California live in poverty. Taxpayers pay about $243 billion each year for public benefits for workers in the fast food industry alone because wages are so low, subsidizing industry. For women and for all Angelenos, we urge you to pass a minimum wage of $15.25 an hour, enforcement, and paid sick days. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Timothy McDaniel. I'm a member of the Watts Neighborhood Council, and I'm also a part of the homeless services provider community, and I'm also a licensed realtor for the state of California. And so what I really want to emphasize today is that in the Watts community, we don't want to hand out. We want to hand up, right? So I want you to change the way you think about Watts and communities like ours, where 60% of our households receive public subsidies. I have to find more people are qualified for homeless vouchers than they are to buy their own home. And I feel that's not the American way, and it shouldn't be Los Angeles way. I'm here to support the restoration of dignity by getting rid of slave wages and respecting worker rights. And also in this 50th year since the historic 1965 Watts Rebellion, if not now, when? And I appreciate you as well, Mr. Price, for supporting the Watts 50 movement and to restore the dignity in our community.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Rafael Ventura. I represent Maintenance Corporation Trust Fund. We are a janitorial watchdog organization that investigates cleaning companies for employment law violation and assist workers in recovery stolen wages. We are funded by responsible contractors in California who face an unfair advantage by the breaking company who underbid them by not paying legal wages, taxes, and workers' compensation insurance. These responsible contractors are already paying $15 an hour along with Exempting benefits package that bring the overall benefit package well about $15 within downtown Los Angeles. These responsible employers are further undercut by the law-breaking company who do not even pay the current legal wage. Law-breaking companies are easily have unpaid of a 60% advantage over responsible union employer. Every day, these employers are losing contract to companies who skirt the law. This provides good, stable jobs that are attempting to provide upward mobility for low-wage working families. We must underscore the importance of the city founding enforcement unit to aggressive person compliance with any ordinance. General good employers are not opposed to paying a higher wage to concern investors in the reality that no one is pushing their competitor who blatantly disregard the law. On behalf of 140 responsible editorial companies, we urge you to level the playing field for responsible employers by developing an enforcement unit that will aggressively enforce a 50 minimum wage. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Nicolas Montaño. I represent a restaurant in Chatsworth where we've been there for 50 years. We have about 70 employees, and we are in favor of the total compensation package. I would encourage you all to try to put this minimum wage package, go slowly, and then think about the tipped employees. We're highly involved with the community in Chatsworth, and this minimum wage hike would definitely impact some of the good deeds that we've been doing for the community. So please go slow and think about the total package. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Yvette Frakes. I actually work for a restaurant franchisee. My first job was with KFC as a team member. My son's first job was with KFC. Increasing minimum wage reduces the availability of these potential jobs and eliminates that stepping stone that our kids need to succeed in future endeavors. The average profit of a restaurant is 4%. Therefore, when you look at increasing minimum wage from 50 to 67%, this cannot be absorbed by restaurants. The wage increase has to be offset somehow. So just to give you an example, like I said, I work for a restaurant industry. We did an 80-20 match on benefits. Now we had to go down to a 70-30. Seattle raised their minimum wage to $15, and now they're experiencing a rising trend in restaurant closures, according to Forbes magazine. So please, all I ask is that you consider what it will do to restaurants and those individuals trying to get jobs to further their career and their place in society. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is going to conclude our hearing this afternoon. We've heard 40 minutes of comment, approximately 20 minutes pro, 20 minutes con. And I think the discussion serves as a great launching pad for the coming weeks as we work to develop a policy that really creates as much good as possible for the largest amount of people. Members, any closing comments?
Yeah. Mr. Chair, let me commend you for conducting this meeting. I think it's an important discussion, and I think it's moving forward. There's a lot to be done. I think we've heard generally, and very positively from the business community. Some groups in favor and some groups with caution talk about the phase-in schedule, and I think we have to listen to that. I personally have a concern in my district. It's a district, I have, fortunately, some large employers, Good Samaritan Hospital, St. Vincent's, USC Medical and USC Private. So I have some larger employers who pay well above it, in large part many of them due to the fact that they're unionized workplaces. And then I have an abundance, and I think you share the same thing, of small businesses, immigrants, entrepreneurs, family-owned businesses that are very small. I mean, these are micro enterprises, and I do have a concern about the impact that it would have on them. Some concerns were also noted, Mr. Krikorian, well stated as always, about some particular businesses, and let's distinguish between work and training. And let's look at the entire package. Let's look at some organizations that are wholly dependent on federal subsidies, and that, as we talked about here, we have some enterprises in which they've taken cuts for the last 3 years. They're at 50% coming up, and it's just difficult for us to imagine keeping them in business, let alone raising their circumstance. It was interesting that most people, with few exception, talked about greater challenges, but not really an inability to do business, and I appreciated the fact that we're getting closer to reality and less and further away from rancor. But it's an important discussion for us to have. It's a dominant discussion. The divide between wealth and poverty in this nation has been ongoing, but it seems to be hitting a critical point, or at least a tipping point, that calls upon both business, policymakers, employers, and employees all to engage in a discussion about how we move forward, both as a city and as a nation. I thank you for your leadership. I think that we have to go forward and think about all the elements. There is no doubt that we have a lot to do. We have to make sure at whatever rate we decide on and whatever pace we decide on, this simply has to be done. We have to make sure that there's enforcement, because it creates competitive disadvantages for those companies that comply to allow others not to comply. And that can no longer be tolerated. And we should, all of us want to make sure that workers in the city do get some time off to take care of themselves or their family, and should get paid for it. Finally, there were some discussions about the cost of living in Los Angeles, and there's no question that it is costly. But there's more work to be done. Last week, we talked about an initiative to clean the city. That's just the right thing to do, but it's also good for business. If we have the cleanest city in America, people will come and do business here just as much as they come because of the weather that we have. For all the things people can talk about, how unfriendly businesses here in Los Angeles, I asked them what's their productivity in the East Coast when they're snowed in. The final thing is there was a discussion about wages versus housing. And I think that's a false discussion. I think obviously we have to have people get paid better. That's just evident by all studies. But we also have to have more housing. I mean, supply is central to that. And we have to build thousands and thousands of units of more housing. We have to recapture those that were foreclosed, put them back on the market. But we have to just build. I mean, the cost of housing will drop when we have an abundant supply, and we won't have abundant supply unless we make the types of reforms that are necessary to make it easier to do business in the city of Los Angeles, and particularly in the housing industry. And so I think that's our package. That's how we go forward. We've gotten great information from the studies and great input from the testimony, and I look forward to you and Mr. Krikorian's ongoing leadership to help us shape a package that makes this a more livable city and a greater city for all the Angelenos. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Today is only the start of our work as we move our debate into the community with a series of hearings in all corners of the city. We always knew that the reports on this issue would tell us the good, the bad, and the ugly about a proposed minimum wage hike. And I think that's what we heard today. And I look forward to continuing to hear from residents, business owners, advocates, and community leaders on this very important matter, one of the most critical civil rights issues of our time. Because, let me be clear, we have a poverty crisis in our city. And this is troubling because it disproportionately impacts people of color living in communities like the one that I represent. The research we heard today confirms that more than 80% of workers impacted by a minimum wage proposal are people of color. We know that working class communities such as South LA, Watts, Pacoima, Boyle Heights, Pico Union, North Hollywood, and Wilmington will have the highest concentration of workers impacted and the most to gain. We know that more than a third of the workers will see raises from this proposal are parents. We also know that their kids will be healthier and perform better in school if we can help them lift their families out of poverty. While some might make claims that raising the minimum wage or establishing one to begin with is bad for business, I would argue that more money in the pockets of Angelenos translates into more spending and a boost of the local economy. We've also heard from some of our studies, we've heard some of our studies back up that claim. Beyond the financial reasons to implement this policy, for me it's a pressing moral responsibility. I want to see residents living on their wages, not barely surviving. It's time that LA reclaim its role as a city of opportunity for all. I'd like to again take a minute to thank our authors for taking time from their busy schedules to be with us today. You provided a great outline for our policy deliberations. I'd like to send a special thank you to the public who has joined us today. Your questions, your questions and comments certainly have been critical to our process, and I invite each of you to join us as we take this show on the road, so to speak. And finally, I want to thank my council colleagues for their thoughtful, probing, and insightful questions. Please be advised that our next hearing will be held on Thursday at 6 p.m. at the Watts Labor Community Action Committee complex, which is located at 10950 South Central. I look forward to seeing all of you then, and I'm excited and eager to continue this inclusive, transparent process as we consider an important policy discussion. If no other business before this committee at this time, this meeting is adjourned.